Buon pomeriggio, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to introduce our workshop, which has been considered a very dialogical platform of exchange, so feel totally and completely involved in our discussions. And we are very glad to see so many friendly faces and new friends that have joined us today from London, from Italy, from all other parts of the world. And we have a very tight schedule, so I'm not going to bother you with some remarks, but we have written some notes that Charles is gonna write also on my behalf, because he has a better pronunciation than me, so I think it's better for Thank you, everyone, and personally it's a great pleasure to be back in London in this splendid building with so many splendid people with whom I've worked for 2 years, so thank you. It's a further thank that I made to Charles and to anyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianmarco. So, despite the formality of the surroundings, the idea is to have a genuinely informal exchange. So, as Gianmarco has said, it's our great pleasure to welcome everyone to this event. Our thanks are due to the AHRC, to the British Academy, the research team, and all areas of the School of Advanced Study, to Kathy Collins and to Jenny Stubbs, the excellence of their support in making today possible. And of course, to our speakers, chairs, and everyone who is here. The workshop is a key part of two projects, Gianmarco's project, Challenging Colonial Legacies in Contemporary Italian Culture, and the project that I'm convening on Uncovering the Afterlife of the Italian Empire. It is part of a series that has included the filmmakers Valerio Ciliaci and Isaac Litzin, the writer and performer Gabriele Germandi, the artist Wissal Harvey, the curatorial team of the Museum of Civilizations in Rome, in dialogue with the Latin American Research Center of the British Museum. In October, we should be welcoming the writer, Najlaa El Ageli, and the coming academic year, we will be pursuing, with our colleague Amy King, a cross-SAS initiative on developing anti-fascist pedagogies. No one needs to be reminded of the nature of the times in which we are living. We live with daily reports of the horror of what is occurring in Gaza and in Ukraine. We see a mounting tide of extremism, and we see the development of what it is appropriate to call global fascism. It needs to be stated that colonialism is not a corollary of fascism, it is integral to fascism, and it is with us here and now. The question for all areas of society, not least the university sector, is how to engage with the times in which we live. The question is also whether the modes of research of the Academy are adequate to the challenges that we face, and whether we should be seeking new modes of intervention which privilege collaboration and co-production, inter-methodological inquiry, the creation of inclusive pedagogical resources, and modes of operating which are mindful of the impact that they can and should exert. The workshop then is specifically concerned with, though not limited to, the legacy of colonialism in contemporary Italy. It aims to discuss the nature and scope of the work that is being pursued across the creative and critical sector, and to explore how new collaborative initiatives can be developed. It aims to create a platform, as Gianmarco said, dialogue that participates in the movement for greater societal intervention. So, that's the theory upon which we are working, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the first session with Isabella Gaffè, Viviana Gravano, and Giulia Grechi. Isabella is a video editor and cultural project manager. Her work revolves around the performing arts, cinema, and video. She produces documentary and creative video works, collaborating with artists, performers, dance, and theatre companies. She's worked with cultural institutes, including Roots Agency, CASMA, Non Museo Capriem, Fede Culture, Festival Oriente Occidente and the Mart at Rovereto. Viviana Gravano is a curator, contemporary art historian. She teaches at the Accademia of Fine Arts in Florence. She is a founding member of the collective Attitudes Spazio e Arti. Her publications include Presente Imperfetto, Eredità coloniali e immaginari razziali contemporanei with Giulia Grechi, Paesaggi attivi, saggio sulla contemplazione, and most recently Discordare, Unremember, ricerche artistiche contemporanee sull'eredità del fascismo in Italia. Artistic contemporary research on the heredity of fascism in Italy. Giulia Grechi is Professor of Cultural Anthropology at the Academy of Fine Arts in Naples. Her work focuses on post-decolonial studies with an emphasis on the cultural legacies of colonialism and contemporary art. She is the co-founder of the curatorial collective Attitudes Spazio e Arti. She's recently published Decolonizzare il museo, Decolonializing the Museum, Mostrazioni pratiche e artistiche, sguardi incarnati, and Disimparare, politiche, poetiche, immaginazione. So, right, I think we're going to have a presentation on the video essay that we've been preparing, and then we'll watch the video essay itself. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Charles Burdett, to University of London, and to all the people that work and the staff for this event. Thank you so much. Browsing the stands of an antiquarian market in Bologna, I discovered a small book. In 1938, the PNF, Fascist National Party, produced a pamphlet entitled La cultura fascista, the fascist culture, dedicated to young people attending political training course. The short text discussed the importance of fascist culture and how to it approach. I got from the original text. The culture of a period is made up of its creations in both the kingdom of scientific knowledge and that of artistic creation. Fascism already has a clear and precise position on these two forms of spiritual activity. The typical characteristic of fascist culture can be defined today, and they will become even more evident in the future. End of quotation. One of the most significant errors that characterized the Italian post-war period was the negation of the existence of a fascist culture during the 20 years of fascist rule. In attempting to erase it, the existence of a culture during the dictatorship was negated in order to reduce its value in the post-fascist period. This produced, for fascist culture, to be restored and revived many times until today. As we know from the 50s, the narrative of Italy has been fundamentally that of a country of resistance, the right and the proper definition. But this served to negate the same country, before the liberation, was an oppressive, colonialist, fascist and tyrannical country. The involvement of many intellectuals and artists built a sort of new innocence for heritage of fascist culture. Erasing everything that fascism created in the cultural context, the artists and the intellectuals don't have to answer why they themselves had contributed largely to its creation. Over time, fascism built a complex, articulated and rhetorically very significant culture, which was not the background for Mussolini's politics, but was in fact a fundamental tool for the construction of the uomo nuovo fascista, new fascist man, and for the realization all of the regime's communication and propaganda projects. The rejection of this obvious reality made it impossible for many years to carry out any real studies on fascist culture. This research has developed in some way in the political and economic fields, obviously, but has been practically absent in the cultural context until the end of the 20th century. We cannot negate the strong responsibility of the disciplines related to art and archaeology in the creation of all oppressive models of the regime, first the racist ones, then the nationalist and the colonial ones. Even today, the common belief is that fascist art, such as il Novecento, the artist movement created by Margherita Sarfatti, or the work of Mario Schironi, or rationalist architecture, first of all, must be considered masterpieces and cannot be subjected to truly radical critical analysis, nor can they be removed or erased from our landscape. To support these positions, all iconographic and symbolic meaning, even the most evident ones, have been removed. The cultural legacy that fascism left in Italy for another century after its hand is not only monuments, buildings, and public work of art, but also a sort of aura of untouchability that surrounds any work from the Mussolini's period, considered a work of high quality that can only be evaluated based on this absolute truth. In Italy, in many public places, including institutional places representing the Italian state, there are still works of fascist art for which discussions continue to be held regarding their aesthetic value, leaving their iconographic significance completely in the background. I would like to cite as a significant example the fresco by Luigi Montanarini in the main hall of the CONI headquarters, Olympic National Italian Committee, in the Foro Italico in Rome, entitled Apotheosis of Fascism. The mural, painted around 1940, represents Benito Mussolini on a hill surrounded by black shirt, camicie nere, which values military and paramilitary formations from the fascist period. In the upper part, a warplane drops bomb, and below, a submarine emerges from the sea. This painting forms the backdrop to the big room where all the most important Italian sporting events taking place in Rome are presented, such as international tennis championship or Olympic ceremonies. This work represents the significance given to physical training for young people during the fascist period. The room was, in the fascist period, the Academy of Men's Gymnastics, a place where boys were trained to become the future soldiers and the fighting forces in Italy, both at home and in the colonies. The painting clearly shows that the intention is to glorify muscular force, violence, and war. Can you imagine a painting that glorifies war and violence as a backdrop for Olympic ceremonies or generally official international events today? Why can Montanarini's painting remain in Italy in the same place where it was during the fascist dictatorship? The first answer can be found in the attitude that art history continues to have in Italy, even today, regarding the work of art from this period. Continue to judge them as masterpieces, expression of a specific historical period, without in any way connecting the formal and aesthetic choices with the content. This position intentionally omits how this contradicts the basis of the Constitution of Italian Republic. When Charles Burdett invited Giulia and me to collaborate on the video essay that will accompany the release of his upcoming book on the legacy of fascism, my first consideration was how important it was to produce material useful of speaking to all generations about the strongly negative influence that this legacy has on our present. Giulia and I decided to combine Charles' fascinating and necessary text with the work of contemporary artists who have been working on the legacy of fascism in Italian colonialism for some time. As Giulia will explain very well in his speech after me, this choice was dictated by the need to position ourselves regarding the colonial archives. Would like also to add that using this work of contemporary artists corresponds to need to consider art as a fundamental tool for trying to read the fascist legacy in depth and to be able to find all possible forms of re-semantization. The last 30 years have shown on several occasions in different places that even in Italy, artists' interventions can be much freer than academic disciplines, which are still too often linked to a conservative vision. The work you will see in the video show how the artist gaze can discuss the sacralized vision of fascist culture in Italy. The choice made with Charles Burdett and videomaker Isabella Gaffè to give visibility to the artist's work in harmony with the text proposes an idea of shared memory and collective action, which we believe is one of the necessary paths today to truly discuss in depth an heritage that is now extremely dangerous and which continues to infect Italian public space. Some of the work of art in the video are clear examples of how art can be used to a critical reinterpretation of the legacy of the fascism in Italy. The work of Giovanni Morbini, I quote only two examples. The work of Giovanni Morbini is a series of photographs entitled Saluto Romano, Roman Salute, highlighted the importance of understanding the origins of some symbolic gestures that are still repeated until today, keeping the same political value. Giovanni began this work by looking at the real origin of this gesture, which was created in Fiume by D'Annunzio in 1920. The writer and the fascist activist made the gesture during a speech after his failed attempt to occupy the city and annex it to Italy, and Mussolini was present. In Morbin's series, the volume of air created by raising the arm in the Roman salute became concrete, materialized throughout a collage of white opaque paper superimposed on vintage photos of people from the fascist period performing the salute. The artists make real and concrete a gesture that seems almost innocent in itself, but in the reality imposes a certain distance, forbidding physical contact between bodies. Giovanni's work helps us understand how fascist education passed through small gestures, permeating every part of the body with the precise intention to dominate bodies in order to shape minds. Another example, the last one, of a work of art in the video essay are some sequences of the video was built in a day by Salvo Lombardo and Daniele Spalò. In this work, the dancers, using the irony, show how the rigid marble architecture of Rome's district can be reinterpreted, highlighting its violent, masculine and patriarchal value. This work of Lombardo Spalò invites to reflect on the symbolism of the rationalist modern fascist architecture form. The analysis of this architecture continue to be only from an aesthetic point of view, and not for its shape, strongly dominant and assertive. Finally, these two examples among the many work featured in the video serve to demonstrate how only a collective effort involving many different figures, such as scholar, researcher, artist, writer, and many others, express the potential today to create an effective and mindful discourse on the fascist legacy in Italy, to re-emerging the ghosts of the Italian Empire, to begin a real process of re-semantization. I would like to conclude by thanking all the artists who generously contributed to this video, making it a fantastic experience for us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Charles, for inviting us to join this terrific project, and thank you, Gianmarco. Thank you to all the staff who organized this meeting, and thank you all for listening. So, in this presentation, I would like to discuss the reasons behind some of the methodological choices we made in creating this visual essay. When Charles proposed working visually and aesthetically on the afterlife of Italian Empire, elaborating this video as a didactic tool, we understood that one of our main goals with Viviana was to highlight how the power of colonial and fascist aesthetics is far from gone. We wanted to show how coloniality is embodied in our cultural background and in how we interpret the world. We wanted it to be clear how these posthumous colonial aesthetics continue to exert a form of violence, especially towards abolitional people, whether in diaspora or with migrant backgrounds. They also affect those who know that a world deems some people less human than others, produces inequalities that concern us all in an intersectional way. At the start of our work, we consulted various public archives on the history of Italian colonialism. And with Saidia Hartman, we soon realized that, quote, to read the archive is to enter a mortuary, end of quote. Our fundamental question in imagining this video essay was, how can we critically show the material and immaterial traces of Italian colonialism without risking to re-legitimize its narratives and reproduce its violence? We did not want to continue reproducing colonial aesthetics without contrasting them in some way. We did not want to show images of bodies and environments devastated by mustard gas, nor the bodies of resistors imprisoned and humiliated by the fascist gates, nor the objects we took and now keep in museum deposits. But at the same time, we didn't want to deny the material and symbolic violence of colonialism and fascism. So the question was, how can we make violence visible without showing it? How to highlight the power of colonial aesthetics while working to dismantle it? We listened to Ariella Zulai, who in her book, Potential History on Learning Imperialism, warns us that, quote, the invitation to enter the colonial archive is a trap, end of quote. We had to find a way to try to go beyond the colonial framing of archives and to disempower colonial aesthetics. For these reasons, we decided not to show the historical images contained in the archives, but to build a visual narratives by juxtaposing the artistic works and activism in an anti-fascist and anti-colonial key. In other words, we chose to highlight the perspective of subjects who have already challenged or reworked colonial architectures, imaginaries, and archives, and who were particularly resonant with Charles' text, agreeing with each one a respectful way of showing their work. This choice relates to two fundamental issues. The first concerns the ethics of historical representation, as Saidia Hartman calls it. We reflect on the fact that colonial archives often tell only the colonizer's perspective, offering knowledge tainted by this filter. If from a historical point of view, these archives are fundamental for reconstructing and documenting the reality of colonial events, and it was very important to bring them to light and make them accessible, we must nevertheless be aware that they are haunted by absence, inhabited by the shadows of all that has not been recorded. We reflected on the fact that showing and making visible are not synonymous, and we felt it necessary to articulate the action of showing in a more complex way, exploring also not showing or showing hiding as aesthetic and political choices. Art historian Benedict Savoy warns against the danger of radical transparency. Showing everything is not synonymous with truth or recognition. While showing everything, exposing colonial archives can raise awareness and provoke shock or indignation, it often fails to reveal how that brutality continues to reproduce itself in the present, or to acknowledge the resistance that fight it now as then, producing counter-memories and counter-narratives. The risk of colonial archives is to normalize the violence they contain. Our risk as researchers is to reproduce it. To avoid this, we must put them to work, challenging our interpretive habits, because archives do not only teach us what to know, but also how to read. We also need to penetrate the cracks in the archives, to break their linear temporality and focus on what is missing, the voices and words left unsaid. By transgressing the archive from its margins, we can give back body to the ghosts that find no place or peace in the colonial archive. With this in mind, the guiding idea of our work was to engage not on ghosts, but with ghosts. That is, to stay in the haunting. As Avery Gordon writes, quote, "If you don't drive it away, if you don't kill it, if you don't reduce it to something you already know how to deal with, if you let it, the ghost can lead you to what is missing, and that is often everything." End quote. This leads us to a second crucial question. What does it mean to work with the spectrality produced by colonialism and fascism? And how can artistic and creative languages make a difference in this process? Working with ghosts means, above all, unmasking the power that produced them. It involves recognizing how this power continues to reproduce itself today and refusing to accept it as an inevitable horizon. As anthropologist Stefania Consigliere writes, domination creates spectrality wherever it operates, and its primary characteristic is its ability to perpetuate itself through ever new forms according to contexts and eras. Consequently, quote, "The world is populated with ghosts and no one can talk about them anymore," end quote. I am referring to the ghosts generated by extractivist logics rooted in Russian capitalism and colonialism. Communities dispossessed of their land, ecosystems ravaged, people enslaved, drowned in the transatlantic trafficking or in today's Mediterranean crossings, genocides of yesterday and today, one unfolding just before our eyes now in Gaza, and those in the diaspora who remain unrecognized as citizens. The ghost is fundamentally a sign of how violence persists. This spectral presence affects us all directly, compelling us to confront the enduring legacies of these violences. Fortunately, ghosts, by definition, make noise. They scream, drag chains, ransack rooms at night. Quote, 124 was spiteful, full of a baby's venom. The women in the house knew it, and so did the children. End of quote. Toni Morrison in Billot. Everyone knows ghosts, yet many fail to recognize them. But how can we not recognize them if they are right before our eyes? To truly recognize these specters, our gaze and perception must be awakened, sharpened, and made conscious. Artistic languages and creative practices can serve as vital tools in this process, helping us to reread the traces of colonialism and fascism with greater awareness and critical insight. At the same time, art can counteract their persistent effects by breaking the habit of perceiving these violences as normal, as part of our everyday scenes, thus challenging their normalization. Art becomes a space for unlearning, for questioning what has been taken for granted, and for opening new ways of seeing that allow us to confront the ghosts haunting our history and present realities. We need to learn to unlearn what Fanon described as the aesthetic forms of respect for the established order, a kind of gaze training that helps us to disassociate from the naturalization of these aesthetics into a canon. This process involves defamiliarizing ourselves with dominant representations, a methodology dear to the ethnographic surrealism movement, which in the 1920s and 30s experimented with radical forms of cultural and anti-colonial critique through collaboration between artists and researchers, ethnographers in that case. This act, which we might call remediation, operates within the apparent representation of archived material or colonial traces, but employs alternative mediums or intervenes directly on images or objects. It creates what can be described as a small perceptual earthquake, an upheaval that opens up an in-between space where the meaning of that object can be critically reconsidered and deconstructed. This process invites viewers to engage actively, transforming the act of looking from passive observation into a space of empowerment, awareness, and responsibility. Unlearning, therefore, is a conscious choice, something no one can be forced into. But remediation is more broadly concerned with disrupting the relationships between objects, spaces, bodies, audiences, and researchers. It is about working with, never on, being careful not to engage in forms of tokenism. Artists and activists are not merely objects of study, they are active subjects and producers of research processes that hold equal dignity with academic endeavors, and sometimes even restore what has been rendered invisible. Recognizing that invisibility does not equate to incomprehensibility allows us to see beyond the limits imposed by traditional disciplines. A gaze outside the boundaries of any academic canon perceives differently than one trained and disciplined within it. This shift in perspective has profound implications for academic research. It challenges the authority of knowledge itself, opening space for a redistribution and pluralization of perspectives and viewpoints that are legitimized to read, interpret, and narrate history. As Clementine Delis writes in the Metabolic Museum, I quote, remediation is not about reappropriating colonial spoils safeguarded in obsolete imperial institutions. It is a process of self-reflexive and critical assessment that necessitates careful and respectful interaction with different agents willing to renegotiate the authority of the host. End of quote. In this sense, for the Academy to establish collaborative research practices with artists and activists is not only useful but essential if we aim to challenge the Eurocentric approach to knowledge and move away from a depository model of education. Our current academic structures rarely provide space for counter-hegemonic knowledge to flourish or be recognized. We urgently need to experiment with emancipatory and transgressive models of education, as Belle suggests, one that resists the authority and reproduction of deeply colonial knowledge systems. Artists and activists have the capacity to produce interference in the linearity of canons, not by merely explaining or representing, but evoking, working within the space of imagination. In this project, we had the opportunity to experiment with a generative methodology, connecting imagination to critique, negotiating the always unstable relationship between what we see and what we know, affirming that imagination is a way of knowing, a tool for envisioning different possibilities. It allows us to glimpse that things could and should be different. It reveals fractures and discontinuities within historical processes, the brutal survivals of coloniality, but also the potential histories, unactualized pasts, and the futures yet to be realized. Reimagining involves looking both backward and forward at the same time to bring out the possibility of counter-memories. Working side by side with artists and activists in this urgent process enables us to experiment through research and education practices rooted in healing, justice, and transformation. Such justice is not merely reparative, acknowledging wounds, but also transformative, actively working to change the conditions that forces that want to remain open. In conclusion, I wish to all of us who feel a responsibility to build a future in which cultural and educational institutions cease to see themselves as neutral spaces and take seriously their role in building plural and transformative knowledges towards a justice rooted in ongoing acts of co-creation and resistance. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really sorry, but today parlerò italiano. Okay. Sono molto felice e onorata di essere qui. Anch'io voglio ringraziare il professor Charles Burdett e staff Gianmarco Mancosu e per questa opportunità di partecipare a un progetto così importante e interessante come è stato quello di realizzare un video saggio partendo dal lavoro Uncovering the Afterlife of the Italian Power. Naturalmente ringrazio anche qui le curatrici, Viviana, Gravano e Giulia Grechi, per avermi coinvolta in questo lavoro e in questa avventura, direi, che ha comportato un cammino lungo e complesso e per molti aspetti sfidanti.
Yeah. Yeah, just Isabella thanking the audience, the curators, for the possibility of working in this area.
Una sfida impegnativa, anche molto stimolante, che si è concretizzata in più di un anno di lavoro, lungo un processo di continuo confronto, con momenti di residenza in cui abbiamo fatto vere e proprie sessioni di lavoro immersivo e momenti frequenti di scambi scritti, parlati, discussi a distanza e anche da vicino. Questo lavoro appunto ha comportato diversi livelli di complessità e il primo livello di complessità dal mio punto di vista è stato quello di entrare in connessione con l'approccio delle curatrici che hanno stabilito, come avete sentito, dei criteri teorici ben precisi e adottato delle scelte curatoriali appunto, che per me sono state una sorta di note di regia, che stabilivano dunque i confini entro cui costruire un paesaggio visivo e sonoro, i cui tratti all'inizio erano sconosciuti. Quando Giulia e Viviana mi hanno parlato della loro scelta di utilizzare solo materiale di artisti e artiste che in qualche modo avessero lavorato sugli stessi temi del lavoro di Charles, mi è sembrata un'idea fantastica, una soluzione sorprendente e coerente con l'intenzione di creare un video saggio che nascesse da un saggio accademico, da un libro, ma che fosse appunto un'opera visiva, con un'estetica e una grammatica proprie, che non hanno nulla o poco a che fare con la parola scritta. Mi sono trovata subito in connessione, sì? Mi sono trovata in connessione, diciamo, questo primo livello è stato facile da superare.
Thank you. It's a brief translation. This is a year's work. It's work that involves various sessions, but the sessions are discussions, they're conversations, and they're about entering into the imagination and practice of a whole group of people, a very extensive group of people. And there are different levels of complexity of this. One is to enter into collective working mode, what co-production really means, both within the theory and the practice of that, and to work within the confines of creating a visual landscape. So this leads to artistic work and a fantastic and coherent idea on the part of the curator to how you link academic and visual work.
Poi è arrivato il secondo livello di difficoltà e complessità, maneggiare, per me insomma, che ho montato quindi il film, maneggiare materiali altrui e nello specifico opere artistiche. Gli artisti e le artiste interpellati hanno generosamente messo a disposizione le loro opere, lavori fotografici, video, installativi. La nostra idea è stata prima di tutto quella di rispettare al massimo il lavoro originale. Quindi, seppur nella necessità di operare delle sintesi, il criterio è stato quello di non intervenire in alcun modo a livello di post-produzione su questi materiali. Questo passaggio ha comportato una difficoltà decisamente maggiore. Il lavoro è stato certosino, millimetrico. Prima, insieme alle curatrici, per produrre lo script che creasse la struttura narrativa, l'amalgama tra le parole e le immagini, e poi il montaggio vero e proprio, fatto pressoché frame by frame, che creasse una omogeneità visivamente e concettualmente coerente, che rispettasse ogni singola autorialità, ma allo stesso tempo rispondesse ad una sua poetica interna.
The second level is managing material, other people's work, and which depends on the generosity of the wide variety of artists through which the work speaks, and not to intervene. to understand the difficulty of working between words and visual images. And this is something that is done only frame by frame, but with a sense of the wider coherence and the poetics of the work.
L'idea quindi è stata quella di raccogliere questa pluralità di sguardi ed estetiche e organizzarla attorno e insieme al discorso di Charles, volendo istituire un'opera video-saggio che al suo scopo didattico e comunicativo potesse aggiungere il valore e il potere evocativo generativo dei linguaggi dell'arte contemporanea. Questa almeno era un'intenzione. Il terzo livello di complessità, le traduzioni. Innanzitutto il primo step, la traduzione inglese verso italiano. Non è mai semplice provare ad appropriarsi di sfumature e intenzioni del testo originale quando si passa da una lingua ad un'altra, naturalmente, e questo vale sempre. Quindi questo è stato il primo livello. Il secondo step è stato quello di passare dal testo scritto al testo detto, e questo è stato ancora più complesso.
The idea is very much to represent a plurality of works. A work that isn't simply an essay, but an essay that is genuinely co-produced and communicative, in which each contributor is speaking through the collective plural process. The third level is the working between English and Italian, the work between a written text and then its iteration in the visual medium, in Italian and in English.
Sì, ci sono due versioni del video, una in italiano e una in inglese. Oggi vedete quella in inglese. Quindi l'idea è stata abbiamo pensato di affidare le due versioni, quindi quella italiana e quella inglese, rispettivamente alla poeta e artista Najlaa El Ageli per l'italiano e all'attore Marco Young per la versione inglese che sentite oggi. Iniziando dalla versione italiana, perché abbiamo scelto Najlaa El Ageli? Perché Najlaa è una poeta, rapper e artista afrodiscendente, la cui pasta vocale e intenzionalità pensavamo potesse fare da collante in questa mole di immagini e concetti espressi nel video. Ho scordato appunto di dire questo, che è una poetessa appunto, ma il suo lavoro parte sempre dalla parola, quindi lavora molto su questo. Credevamo quindi che Najlaa potesse aiutarci, grazie alla sua sensibilità e capacità, a non cadere in una narrazione retorica. E in realtà pensiamo abbia fatto anche di più, perché nella voce Najlaa apporta e porta tutto il corpo. È stato proprio un corpo a corpo quello che lei ha operato con le parole del saggio, lottando con esse, per quanto forte è stato l'impatto di quello che esprimevano. Ci ha restituito un'interpretazione potente, anche molto efficace. La versione inglese è stata tutt'altra versione ancora, in primis banalmente perché è una voce maschile. E la versione è stata interpretata appunto da Marco Young, che è un attore, quindi anche lui un artista che lavora oltre che col corpo con la parola, e Marco ci ha restituito un'altra qualità ancora del parlato, più istituzionale se vogliamo, forse più portata verso l'immagine quasi che verso la parola detta. Ultimo, non so se vuoi dire questo.
Yeah. So, just thinking about the two versions, one by the Italian version is read by the Italo-African rapper, poet and artist Najlaa El Ageli, whose visual work works with words, starts with words, and the process of working with the essay is one of engagement, communication, understanding, embodying the text and engaging with it. It isn't simply read. She uses a whole body in her performances, and that is something that she certainly brought to the interpretation of the video essay. Marco Young, also an artist, an actor who works with words, but it's a different version, and it speaks in different ways.
Ultimo ma non ultimo elemento portante è stato il suono del sound designer Paolo Zappalà. Paolo ha iniziato a lavorare partendo da uno scambio di parole, di concetti. Abbiamo discusso sul concetto di fantasmatico che ci ha guidato, uno dei criteri, diciamo, che ci ha guidato nella costruzione del video, di riverbero. Abbiamo parlato di suoni in questo caso, ma anche non solo, di concetti, di presenze che ci sono ma non si vedono. E dopodiché Paolo ha iniziato ha ascoltato il testo, prima in italiano qui e poi ha iniziato a lavorare sulle prime prove di montaggio. Ho perso la traccia. Diciamo che abbiamo poi proseguito.
Final element is the sound artist, Paolo Zappalà, who works with concepts, works very much with sounds, reading of the text, and then to translate the visual and the textual into a sound process, which is based on listening and impression.
No? Insomma, è stato un lavoro anche con lui di continuo rimbalzo, insomma, di passarci come la palla fino a creare appunto tutto il tappeto sonoro che comunque anche in questo caso si amalgama, si compenetra, diciamo, con il parlato, con le immagini, con anche le parole scritte. E, insomma, questo lavoro, per concludere, è stato un processo di continua rimediazione, traduzione, con una dinamica costante, diciamo, di rimbalzo tra tutti questi sguardi e tutti questi livelli di linguaggio. E direi che il video è stato costruito in questo senso come una partitura quasi musicale. Grazie.
The sound field is, of course, in itself a remediation, and it's a remediation between different gazes, between different languages, between different visual repertories. The video in itself, of course, talks about colonialism. It doesn't hide from colonialism, but it does so always through remediation, which, whether that is sound, text, visual, and it is above all plural. So we'll play the video, its first official outing. It lasts about 50 minutes, and then there should be space for questions afterwards. I apologise for the non-optimal amount of light. Nothing is never a bad thing.
And they're with us. They're standing with us right now.
When we see authoritarian movements gain in popularity, when openly extremist parties play a role in government, when xenophobic language leads to shocking acts of violence, we might ask ourselves, what ghosts continue to haunt the present? We might wonder whether dictatorship, ethnically based persecution, or colonialism are phenomena that belong exclusively to the past, or whether we risk the possibility, perhaps in a disguised form, of their re-apparition. In words of Rome's former prefect, Giuseppe Pecoraro, the ghosts of the 20th century are still dangerous. In the specific context of contemporary Italy, it is a matter of urgent necessity to reflect on the nature of fascism, on the principles on which it was based, on the effects of its policies, and on the surreptitious continuation of its worldview and values. It is more important than ever to understand why aspects of fascism appeal to so many people for such a long period of time. To understand how fascism exerted a hypnotic power by grafting itself onto pre-existing structures of thought and belief. The sentence of the philosopher and writer George Santayana that those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it is often quoted. But the point is not that we should simply look at the past assuming that we are free from its influence. The point is rather that deliverance from the spectre of having to relive the horrors of preceding decades or centuries comes at the cost of constant inquiry into the ways in which apparently surmounted motivations and practices are imbricated in the way in which we think and feel. It may be difficult, if not impossible, to give an all-encompassing account of the meaning of Italian fascism because of the length of time that the regime was in power, because of the evolving nature of its ideology, because of the sheer extent of its sphere of activity. But it is essential to develop a knowledge that goes beyond a narrative account of the events that occurred during the 1920s and 1930s. To identify, that is, the conceptual structure behind the world that fascism attempted to create. And to understand how the logic of the regime determined the roles that Italians were meant to perform, creating material and psychological legacies that are with us to this day. The most important feature of Italian fascism was that it did not propose merely to promote alterations to an already existing order. Its aim, much more fundamentally, was to refashion both the socially constructed world and the inner subjectivity of Italians. The eschatological purpose of fascism was, that is, to coerce the Italian population as a whole to participate in its vast project of renewal. Under fascism, the notion, essential to liberalism, that society functions primarily as a means to enable the individual to fulfill independently his or her potential, was reversed. Under fascism, the individual, rather than being seen as separable from society, was equated with society. This is a point that is made with startling clarity in the definition of ideology of the movement. jointly written by Giovanni Gentile and Benito Mussolini for the Enciclopedia Italiana, where we read, "For the fascists, everything is in the state. Nothing that is human or spiritual exists outside the state. In this sense, fascism is totalitarian. It intends to remake not the forms of human life, but its content, the human being, their character, their faith. And to this end, it requires discipline, an authority that descends into the spirit of everyone, where it dominates unopposed." There is no ambiguity here about the coercive role that the state was intended to perform, or about defining fascism as a kind of religion, or una concezione religiosa, religious conception. The function of the state was to reform all elements of the human being according to its conception of the spirit of the national community. The individual, by placing his or her identity within the life of the nation, would begin to experience an altered state of consciousness and a truly collective existence. The thesis of the contemporary historian Emilio Gentile is that fascism should be seen as a secular religion which sought to transform Italians into a strong and unified community, capable not only of meeting the challenges of the modern world, but of revivifying the spirit of ancient Roman greatness. Gentile points to the sense of unity and purpose, of sacrifice to the ideal of the nation that early adherents to the movement took from the experience of the First World War. He exposes, however, that the body of ideas regarding the sacralization of politics had a far longer history. He refers to the origins of the deification of the nation in the work of the thinkers of the Enlightenment, the crystallization during the French Revolution, the concept of the state as the educator of the people in the cult of the nation. And he refers to the development of the theory of the nation as a sacred entity in the various currents of thought that fed into the Risorgimento and on which Italian fascism grew. The ethno-nationalist order of fascism endowed with the properties of the sacred could be apprehended by contemplating the territorial extent of the Roman Empire, its duration through time, and the surviving evidence of its presence. The constant references to Rome, the presence of ancient designs in modern constructions, the suggested meanings of official dress and ceremony, all serve to upset a distinction between antiquity and modernity, to weld them together so that each was seen through the other, and both were seen as part of an entity, the true nature of which lay beyond habitual perception. The point is not that the regime fostered belief in a metaphysical world, evident in its architectural projects, its extensive rituals, its rigid codifications of behaviour. The point is rather that the rationale of fascism was to induce society to conform to the principles of the order that it posited. If the First World War had enacted the beginning of the nation's rebirth, its palingenesis, to use Roger Griffin's term, then fascism aimed to ensure the continual renewal of the nation. The ultranationalism of the movement was not elitist but popular, since all strata of society were insistently led to believe that they were active participants in the colossal process of regeneration, or to use historian Ruth Ben-Ghiat's term, reclamation, the regime had set in motion. Understanding of the multiple roles that rituals serve during the Ventennio enables an essential part of the creation of the material world of the interwar years to come clearly into focus. The gargantuan scale on which the regime refashioned Italian towns, tore down whole districts in the heart of Rome, built new communities in previously unoccupied parts of the country, isolated and restored ancient Roman monuments, is widely known. The building projects provided physical evidence of the path towards order and prosperity, instances of the rationalization of social processes, and the dominance of the regime in all parts of the lives of Italians. But the purpose of the massive architectural projects of the interwar period was also to create nothing less than a new reality, intended to act back on its original producers, infiltrate an inner sense of their relation with the external world, and, by the materiality of its existence, perform an intimidating function in making people believe that the world of which it provided objective evidence constituted the very reality in which they lived. The monumental structures that are to be found in almost every Italian town or city are concrete indications of the new reality that Italian fascism sought to build in the 1920s and 1930s, physical statements of the futural logic of the regime. And yet, in themselves, they offer an incomplete picture of the material and conceptual world that the regime sought to create. Integral to fascist ideology was the plan to extend the borders of Italy, to create an expanding imperial dominion, and to rival the territorial possessions of the major democratic powers. In the words of one commentator, it was overseas that Italians needed to confront the hard path of their new history. It is true that expansion of the Italian nation did not begin with the regime. Eritrea and large parts of Somalia came under Italian rule at the end of the 19th century, while Libya was acquired as a result of the Italo-Turkish War between 1911 and 1912. The reconquest of Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, or the forceful establishment of Italian authority beyond the coastal towns of the territory, was set in motion from 1921. But the essential difference between liberal and fascist expansionism was that Mussolini was prepared to use armed force more systematically than previous administrations, and more than other colonial powers were prepared to do during the same period. From 1925 onwards, fascist Italy, through its increasing manipulation of the media, gave a prominence to colonial themes that would, in the words of historian Nicola Labanca, have been unthinkable under liberalism. The emphasis on expansionism was part of the new politics of the regime, in which the whole armory of the state was deployed in a mobilization of public consciousness that was aimed not simply at encouraging greater awareness of, and therefore commitment to, the imperial ambitions of the regime, but at promoting belief in the mythologizing narratives such as the return to what were once the possessions of ancient Rome, or the founding of a new civilization that supposedly legitimized expansion. The operation to reconquer Libya was not concluded until 1932. In October 1935, Italy launched its invasion of Ethiopia. Although victory was celebrated with Mussolini's declaration of the re-apparition of the Roman Empire in May 1936, resistance to Italian occupation continued until the fall of fascism. In 1936, Italy sent troops to support Franco in Spain, and they remained there until the conclusion of the Spanish Civil War. In 1939, Italy annexed Albania, and in 1940, it invaded Greece and southern France. Italy entered the Second World War on the side of Nazi Germany, with the expectation that it would make substantial territorial gains across Africa and the Middle East. It was in the colonies that the fascist project of rupturing the existing social order to pursue a dramatic and violent process of world creation was taken to its logical extreme. The environment that was brought into existence, first through the massive exertion of military force, and then through the deployment of a vast workforce of Italian and African labour, was made to seem, through newsreels, photographic reportage, and through film, as nothing less than a prodigious fulfilment of the promise of a new society. Italian East Africa was presented as the mirror of national life under fascism, and as a site where the power of the state could be experienced to the full. This is a point made by the many exhibitions on the Italian mainland. In Libya, as in the Italian peninsula, the remains of Roman buildings and monuments were restored and used repeatedly for their propagandistic value. In all parts of the empire, Roman architecture was imitated, while major building projects such as Aio were presented as blueprints for the ideal colonial city. And it was in the colonies that the principles behind the creation of the new reality of fascism became most apparent. Apparent in the rigid imposition of a system of governance, in the exploitation of the resources and labour of the countries that were occupied, in the hierarchies that were established between settler and subject populations, and apparent, most starkly, in the relentless use of force to quell any form of opposition to Italian rule, in the violence used to suppress resistance in Libya and in Ethiopia. Despite the huge investment of resources, however, and despite the massive use of force in its creation, the Italian Empire was a hastily constructed edifice that came crashing down with extraordinary speed. By 1942, Allied troops had moved into most of Italy's former territories. The demise of Italy as a colonial power was to be confirmed in the settlement of the country's possessions in Africa. In 1949, Libya gained the right to form an independent state, while Somalia was placed for 10 years under the trusteeship of Italy. In December 1950, the UN approved a settlement whereby Eritrea became an autonomous state, federated to the Ethiopia of Haile Selassie. The belatedness of sustained inquiry into the the history of the imperial phase of Italian fascism has meant that awareness of the legacies of empire is not as widespread as it should be. Those legacies concern the effects on the countries where Italy was the colonial power, the material remnants of the infrastructure that was built to support the imperial project, the nature of the lives that people have led in the north and east of Africa as a result of the years of Italian rule. Even if we confine ourselves to the task of uncovering the legacies of expansionism that are present in contemporary Italy, the task is imposing. It is imposing because those legacies can be found in almost every area of life, and because we are not speaking merely about the discovery of traces of historical significance, but about the active role of those legacies. It is indeed appropriate to speak of an afterlife of empire. To speak, that is, of the agency that material structures and patterns of belief or behaviour related to colonialism continue to exert long after the demise of empire, and long after the fact that colonialism should belong exclusively to the past. In speaking of an afterlife, one is referring to something that, though formerly deceased, nevertheless exerts an unstable but diffuse influence, always at one remove from unequivocal identification. The force of nostalgia for empire can be experienced both in real-life occurrences and through print or visual culture. In the rallies that mark the anniversaries of fascism, or in memorials to some of its most prominent figures, Italy's former identity as a colonial power is evoked through ritualistic demonstrations. Many groups and online communities testify to an unrepentant attachment to the narratives that nourished expansionism, into the certainties that supposedly once governed the way in which the world functioned. But the afterlife of the Italian Empire is far from being contained within the activities of fringe groupings. No one would argue that it is not possible to trace elements of thinking that characterize the fascist worldview in statements that are occasionally made in public life, or, for example, in the reluctance of certain politicians to state their allegiance to the concept of anti-fascism. In precisely the same way, one can see remnants of colonial thinking in the use of various kinds of visual imagery, in the willingness of groups or individuals to espouse views that depend on hierarchical distinctions between cultures, in statements that imply that Italian identity is fixed and exclusive, rather than the result of the meeting and mixing of a multiplicity of cultural influences. Equally, imperial resonances are encoded in the architecture of given sites, in the vision of nationhood that they communicate, and in the authority that they confer on key principles behind expansionism. The problem, then, is that if the debris of the conceptual and material complex that once constituted Italian imperialism is present at the level of imaginings, frameworks, unconscious identifications, then it is not immediately apparent. If, consequently, this imperial debris exists at a level below plain sight, then it is difficult to uncover the agency that it exerts and expose that agency to scrutiny. The danger of not doing so is that certain modes of thought become built into the way in which the world is perceived, and they are allowed to function as a legitimate point of reference in responding to the manifold social and political issues that impinge upon the present. The question is, therefore, through what means can one see how far elements of the past continue to cast their shadow over the present? What, in other words, are the media that enable us to develop an enhanced perception of the afterlife of empire? And how can the insights that they provide be brought together to understand how aspects of the colonial world continue to exercise a presence and an agency in our lives? What would Italy look like today if the country had not participated in the Second World War, and if Mussolini had remained in power until the 1960s or 1970s? The centre of most Italian towns would, no doubt, be characterised by a refashioned square of impressive proportions, by institutional buildings constructed according to rigid geographical patterns, by statues fixed in human form in martial poses. As things stand, it is appropriate to see many of the buildings of the interwar period as a kind of ruin. A ruin because the edifices have survived beyond their original setting, and they convey messages in the present that, depending on your perspective, seem obsolete, discordant, and disconcerting. The very materiality of the institutional buildings of the 1920s and 1930s make them one of the most potent reminders of fascism and its manifest imperial dimension. The massive building projects on the Italian mainland, such as EO, or the area in Naples that once housed the Mostra dell'Italia Oltremare, were intended as a reflection of the building projects undertaken on a vast scale in Italy's colonies. Architectural forms, whatever the nature of their aesthetic qualities, are far from innocent. They can, in the words of Peter Friedel, play a major part in ordering the world along ethno-nationalistic lines. All such sites convey explicit and subliminal messages. They present an aggressive notion of nationhood that is oddly discordant in a republic whose founding narrative is resistance to fascism. It may be true that such sites are too pervasive, too firmly entrenched, ever to be removed. But it is only by identifying the purpose and effect of the signs that they communicate, and by subverting their original meaning, that one can ensure that the power that they exert is exposed. In this regard, public art projects like that, for example, of DAAR, Decolonizing Architecture Art Research, by Sandy Hilal and Alessandra Ferrini, form a highly significant function in drawing attention to the semiotics of the buildings and involving local communities in reflecting on their meanings. The role that architecture performs in processes of perception and association is thus shifted from the unconscious to the conscious. The The materiality of the building projects of the interwar period is shared by another medium through which one can come face to face with the ideological components of fascism, as well as sense the lingering presence in today's world, and that is the exposition of artifacts from the period in museums. The Depository of Rome's Museo della Civiltà houses the collection of the former colonial museum, founded during the 1920s, and intended as a vehicle for expansionist propaganda. The collection comprises objects from Italy's former colonies, expressive of difficult and disputed memories, busts of soldiers and politicians of the period, works of art, paintings, sculptures, and architectural models from regions of northern and eastern Africa, objects that express the violence of colonization, objects that have a very strong value for formerly occupied society, and that, in many instances, are the subject of requests for restitution. The sensitivity of the curatorial task is rendered acute by the ethical necessity of documenting the provenance of the articles that comprise the collection and of assessing the degree of violence that was involved in their procurement. One of the most graphic indications of the extent of this work is the fact that the collection contains many casts of the faces of inhabitants of different regions of Ethiopia that were made by the Italian anthropologist Lidio Cipriani in the late 1930s. A further issue is how elements from the collection can be displayed to audience in such a way that they do not replicate, however unintentionally, the values of the original colonial museum. It demonstrates instead the racialized systems of thought on which the whole expansionist enterprise was based. This task is made all the more difficult by the fact that the museum is located within the Eo district, the very center of the massive exhibition complex of the regime, and the presence of which is everywhere apparent. Over the last 10 years, the collection of the former colonial museum has been the subject of national and international research initiatives, which have led to the realization of site-specific installations and performances by groups, such as the contemporary dance company MK, and by artists such as Delio Yasser, Luca Capuano, Camilla Casadei Maldini, and Leona Contini, an artist and anthropologist who has followed the collection since before it came to the Museo della Civiltà.
Allora, il lavoro con il Museo della Civiltà comincia nel 2016, quando Art Schneider, antropologo che, insomma, che insegna alla Oslo University e che si è occupato anche di rapporto d'arte e antropologia, mi invita a far parte di questo gruppo di ricerca nel contesto del progetto europeo Traces, Transmitted Contentious Heritage of the Arts. Appunto, come le pratiche artistiche possono maneggiare questi patrimoni problematici. Noi siamo arrivati in un momento in cui questa collezione si stava svegliando da questa morte in qualche modo, no? Era stato un momento di strano, di transizione istituzionale. In realtà è stata la cosa che mi ha attratto moltissimo, questa cosa che la collezione non era in un limbo istituzionale, quindi non era più, ovviamente inizialmente era parte del sottoministero dell'economia, poi è diventata il Ministero degli Esteri, poi si stava transitando in una fase di, appunto, difficilmente descrivibile, ma era una fase di cui tutto ancora poteva succedere. Era tutto un risveglio che cominciava e ho avuto la fortuna di assistere a questo momento, a questa transizione e anche di documentarla Quindi in quegli anni lì ho avuto la possibilità di accedere a narrazioni critiche rispetto alla storia coloniale e in generale anche alle forme di sfruttamento contemporaneo, no? Neocoloniali, si potrebbe dire. Quindi cominciamo a circolare questi termini, no? Quindi in realtà nasceva appunto da un miscuglio di questioni personali, private e dal mio attivismo, diciamo, se possiamo definire, sì, penso possiamo definire l'attivismo.
Under the direction of Andrea Villani, the curators of the former Colonial Museum, Rosanna Vilella and Gaia Del Pino, together with Matteo Lucchetti, responsible for the museum's collections of contemporary art and culture, have pursued a profound collaboration with contemporary artists, either through their residential program, including projects with Maria Teresa Alves, Sami Baloi, DAAR, Sandy Hilal and Alessandra Ferrini, Garabing Film and Art Collective, or through the acquisition of works by contemporary artists. The collaboration with contemporary artists has been key to the realisation of the exhibition, The Museum of Opacities, inaugurated in June 2022, in which part of the collection of the former Colonial Museum has been exhibited in critical dialogue with the work of artists, including Jermaine Michael Gabriel, Francis Hoffman, Atinaju Injida, Dio Eshetu, Balachiao Yamar, Adelita Husni Bey, Luca Guadagnino, Peter Friedel, Rosella Biscotti, Bianca Baldi, Malak El Ghuel and Wissam Hubabi.
Allora, il percorso Museo delle Opacità è un allestimento temporaneo ma allo stesso tempo permanente, un work in progress, il risultato di un lavoro collettivo di riflessione, un lavoro collettivo che nasce già come staff del museo, è un percorso che è stato curato da Gaia Del Pino, Matteo Lucchetti e me, e che quindi già all'interno della sua concezione vede un dialogo tra noi curatrici delle collezioni dell'ex museo coloniale con appunto il curatore per le arti e culture contemporanee del Museo delle Civiltà. Il percorso che ci ha portato a immaginare questo nuovo allestimento viene da una serie di sperimentazioni, di riflessioni che abbiamo fatto negli anni su queste collezioni, il tentativo appunto di rileggere, riscrivere, risignificare gli oggetti in una logica contemporanea, postcoloniale, in modo da risignificare e contestualizzare gli oggetti e le raccolte del museo in un contesto storico, ma anche tentando di oggi domandarci che destinazione dare a questi oggetti e a queste collezioni. Quindi è un lavoro lungo di riflessione, di riscrittura, di decostruzione che ha visto la partecipazione di diversi soggetti, artisti, scrittori e scrittrici e studiosi ovviamente, studiose, che negli anni, da quando appunto le collezioni sono arrivate al Museo delle Civiltà, hanno creato una zona porosa insieme a noi di ridiscussione delle collezioni in ottica contemporanea. Quindi quando abbiamo iniziato a ragionare insieme a Gaia e Matteo su questo nuovo percorso, abbiamo individuato nell'arte contemporanea, nei linguaggi contemporanei, una modalità, uno strumento che ci potesse permettere di avviare questo lavoro sempre più profondo di rilettura degli oggetti e delle storie. Spesso nelle collezioni dell'ex museo coloniale noi abbiamo oggetti che rimandano a storie, visioni e a narrative che portano al centro lo sguardo degli italiani, dei conquistatori, con una fortissima marginalità invece delle altre narrazioni che provengono da chi ha subito la colonizzazione. Quindi con il Museo delle Opacità il tentativo è stato quello di affiancare le narrazioni alle propagande, alle retoriche di esaltazione fasciste che troviamo nel nostro museo, nelle collezioni dell'ex museo coloniale, con delle contronarrazioni, delle nuove visioni che potessero provenire appunto da artisti e da diversi soggetti che intercettano anche l'attivismo, che potessero, diciamo, chiudere un po' e andare a coprire dei buchi della storia, delle modalità di raccontare la storia che fossero solo unilaterali. Quindi l'idea è stata quella di allargare lo sguardo sicuramente.
Stemming from a period of residence at the museum as part of the European-wide initiative Taking Care, Wissam Hubabi, together with Ismail Astru Low and Roy Giordani, pursued a participative project with a number of Rome's cultural communities, which gave life to the installation Photo Museum Rome, exhibited at the Museum of Opacities.
Il principio per me è molto semplice, cioè non conoscere il colonialismo italiano significa conoscere la storia d'Italia in parte, che per me diciamo avere la competenza della storia italiana è una prassi da buona cittadina in primis. Seconda cosa, percepisco diciamo, nel mio interesse verso il colonialismo italiano, verso la storia rimossa del colonialismo italiano, mi percepisco come alleata perché appunto fossi nel paese coloniale, come potrebbe essere la Francia o la Spagna, vorrei avere da parte della diaspora la stessa sensibilità e comunque in ogni caso diciamo, siamo tutti figli dei colonizzati, quindi mi immedesimo molto facilmente nella storia diciamo, di chi appartiene alla diaspora eritrea e chi io che somala o libica, proprio in quanto colonizzata da altri paesi. In un certo senso è l'Europa in sé che è un sistema imperialista che va visto in una forma di alleanza anticoloniale in toto, non ci si può soffermare soltanto sulla propria storia specifica perché appunto viviamo in una comunità europea e da buona cittadina la voglio decolonizzare perché volevo scimmiottare un po' diciamo, la visione accademica. Ho detto adesso vedrai, sicuramente quando la mia lingua orale sarà estinta, perché per come vanno avanti le cose si estingueranno tutte le lingue in diaspora, i nostri figli non ne parleranno oppure la parleranno sempre peggio eccetera eccetera, allora solo lì inizierà tutto un procedimento accademico archeologico di ricostruzione della lingua eccetera e quindi non saremo più noi padroni di questa lingua ma diventeranno gli studi accademici. Tutto parte da una conferenza che inaugura qualcosa e allora quando ho partecipato al bando del Museo delle Civiltà ho detto devo inaugurare qualcosa e quindi devo creare una pari istituzione. E perché parlo lì? Perché è un ex museo coloniale, almeno quella sezione diciamo, vedeva la messa in discussione di un museo coloniale, ex museo coloniale, e io ho pensato posso fare un progetto all'interno di un'istituzione che si occupa di colonialismo soltanto creando una para istituzione che scimmiotti un'istituzione.
Another medium of exceptional power is literary communication. What has become clear over recent years is the ability of literature to draw public attention to episodes that belong to the history of fascism and colonialism. Writers use fiction as a means of understanding how events that seem to be distant in time continue to affect the experience of the present, both at the level of public discourse and at the level of individual subjectivity. By delving into episodes of family history, instances of archival research, developments in the political sphere, literary texts show how a knowledge of the past unsettles our habitual relationship with the reality that surrounds us. More profoundly still, writing can chart a movement from a stable notion of personal identity to an altogether more disturbing experience of everyday selfhood. Antonio Scorati's tetralogy of historical novels and the life of Mussolini has attracted hundreds of thousands of readers. Marza Mengistu's narration in her novel The Shadow King of the invasion of Ethiopia from the perspective of the Ethiopian resistance was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 2020. Writers like Gabriele Germandi, Vittorio Longhi, Francesca Menandri, Shirin Ramzamali Fazel, and Ejabia Sheikho have attracted large audiences as well as international recognition for their work in disseminating knowledge of a chapter of the past of ever more topical importance.
The way that men and women reacted to the book and to the story, regardless of their education, cultural level, background. Because I realized that men, also the one who reviewed the book, in the literary world or the academic world, men tend to focus on racism, on the side of the book that tends to analyze and to represent, the evil consequences of a racist culture, of a racist approach of these Europeans, like my great-grandfather, and the consequences about that. While women, female readers, understood that the core of the book is criticism against the patriarchal model and the patriarchal system. And what I realized while I was writing the book is that our colonial history, analyzing my own family and the way our colonial history, Italian colonial history, influenced the story of my own family. It was so much about the patriarchal idea of society. So it was not just racism, but there was so much misogyny and chauvinism in the way we approach Africa. More and more, I feel the urgency to address those issues, to follow the recommendation of the European Parliament. So it's not just a domestic thing, it's a European issue. It's something that we have to deal with, and the whole, say, culture world, like, again, the arts, writers, journalists, the media, and filmmakers, they have a responsibility, and they should help to, foster this collective will in Gramscian terms, to open that closer about the dark side of Italian colonialism, and make it public, make it open, and try to see what are the consequences still today in the way we approach global south.
Literature allows or creates a space where potentially, you don't have to, it's not a duty, but potentially you are allowed to identify or even just to have a glimpse of what's inside the head of people who might be not just different from you or not even just very different from you, but accidentally the opposite of what you believe yourself as, or how you define yourself as, which doesn't mean justifying the action, doesn't mean agreeing with them, not at all, but it does mean, well, they're human, just like you are, that's on mind, there's no denying that. And so it's this possibility of looking at the world not just from your own righteous viewpoint, or right, or rightful apparently, justifyingly so apparently. And this also doesn't mean that as I write I necessarily change drastically my viewpoint. I still think that clothing extraction is wrong. I haven't changed my opinion about that. But, and that clothing massacres are not pretty things. I haven't changed my opinion about that. But I have explored more consciously and thereby inviting my reader to also come to meet this journey of exploration of other viewpoints which are not so, which don't start off as being so clearly against or for, who are just having an experience. Therefore, for instance, in San Francisco, my protagonist, Attilio Profetti, he holds many values which I don't own. Very, I like it also that my readers don't. But it still exists, and it still existed, especially, and it still exists today as a viewpoint on the world, and which has had and still has a lot of impact on the world, consequences of action and effects. So it's worthwhile having a look. And maybe, not just to, again, judge it, but to really explore it, and at some point maybe even see where we have something in common.
Io ho cominciato a scrivere perché volevo raccontare del mio paese, volevo dire che quello che veniva narrato non era la realtà. Io venivo da un paese che aveva una storia molto antica, venivo da una città che aveva una comunità internazionale molto potente, ero cresciuto in un ambiente, per esempio, da un punto di vista musicale, nella città di Addis Abeba io ho ascoltato Fela Kuti, ma ho ascoltato anche i Black Sabbath, ho ascoltato i Beatles, ma ho ascoltato i cantanti etiopi dell'era del Golden Age come Alemaio Shete, come Mahmoud Ahmed, ho ascoltato il rebettico greco e poi sono arrivata qui e quindi tutta questa disparità tra la narrazione e la realtà mi ha fatto venire voglia di scrivere. Io quando ho scritto ho pensato di fare un romanzo corale perché sempre per questo concetto che la storia siamo noi, la storia non è fatta da grandi personaggi. In realtà i grandi personaggi stiamo lì perché tutti noi piccoli gli permettiamo di stare. E il fatto che fosse una storia corale dà la dimensione anche della violenza, perché se avessi raccontato una storia sola sarebbe stata una storia violenta su una singola persona o dipanato lungo un unico aneddoto, mentre la coralità dà una dimensione più tangibile di quello che è la violenza fatta su un intero paese.
By drawing together the insights of curatorial and creative practice, one can reach an enhanced understanding of the ways in which happenings that belong to the past continue to shape the world in which we live. By investigating the signs that the external world communicates, by recreating the context in which artifacts now housed in museums once assumed meaning, by listening to the voices that are captured through literature, one can move between the visible and the invisible. Between, that is, the de facto material presence of cultural phenomena and the wider system of imaginings, psychological processes, and collective power structures of which they are a part. And in this historical moment, the need to find mirrors that facilitate our understanding of how the past is reflected in the present could not be clearer, nor of greater urgency.
Yeah, well, well, we'll go on slightly. We'll start just yeah, we've got a good 10, perhaps slightly longer minutes for questions. So, any comments to the curatorial team with about that observation? Francesca.
Should I get a mic?
No, I'll
Should I speak in English?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting work, especially the artistic re-elaborations were really fascinating. However, I have a problem with the basic assumption of this work, and I would like to ask you to comment on this problematicity which I find, which is a conflation somewhat of fascism with colonialism, which of course you explained that, for instance, Eritrea was colonized before rise of Mussolini, you mentioned this. But it seems like I have two strands of problems. One is you talk about, you define totalitarianism, fascism, as the I merging into the collective, which is a good explanation, but which is of course something which doesn't apply only to fascism, but to totalitarianism in general. Even Stalinism was like this. So it's a totalitarian view as the totality of society. So that's one of my two questions I have. And the other, more pertinent to the topic of our conference, is I find the assumption, the statement by, I think it was Lavanca, that fascist colonialism was of a level of violence unheard of before, extremely problematic. I mean, we are a few blocks away from the British Museum, which is the collection of one of the largest and most fused colonial empires, and of course, liberal colonialism, many massacres and genocides, and or on the other side of the planet, Russian expansionism towards the Caucasus and Siberia. I mean, all of colonialism is extremely violent by definition. So my problem is, and my question is, how do we escape, we being Italians, from this curse of jumping from Italiani brava gente, Italians the good ones, to Italiani the worst ones? And because I fear that there is a risk of once again escaping basically from history. Either we were the only good colonizers, which is an oxymoron, or we were the worst. In both cases, I feel I'm escaped from actually the complexity of history, which troubles me, and I would like you to comment on this.
Yeah. Sure, I'll comment first on that. Fascism and colonialism, the conflation, I don't think it is an artificial conflation. If you think about the rhetoric of fascism, the way that it is born from the First World War, that it is violent from the start, that from the early 1920s, with the accelerated reclassification, the term that was used of Libya, and subsequently with the desire to expand beyond Eritrea, and then subsequently the invasion of Ethiopia, Spanish Civil War, subsequently the designs to take over large parts of the Middle East and Africa. It is integral to fascist ideology. I don't think, and accelerated by fascist ideology and inflected by fascist ideology. So therefore, to see that colonialism is some kind only a dimension of fascism is, I don't think, to understand what fascism was from its outside, or indeed the notion of the expansion of the Italian nation that is bound in the very ethno-nationalist concept of nation. So I think that it really isn't, many people of course make a distinction between fascism and colonialism, I'm saying it's a byproduct, but I think that is a profound misunderstanding of the way in which fascism orchestrated its activity from the beginning, and a misunderstanding of the expansionist logics of nationhood in the early part of the 20th century. That is not to say, absolutely, that fascism was alone in this, but however, it is, so I think we fall a bit into the trap of seeing, of actually being apologetic for fascism if we don't see expansionism as part of it.
So think of it on the definition of colonialism.
Yeah, no, but I mean, in terms of what you say about the temporality of colonialism and its millennial certain structures of the 18th, 19th century, absolutely. The colonial world is all around us. It is present in where we are speaking at the moment. I don't think there is any discussion about that or implication that the Italian example is unique. Quite the reverse. The phrase that Labanchi uses is specific to the 1920s and 1930s and the acceleration and modality of colonialism under fascism. What fascism does in the 1920s and 30s is a different temporality from the long-standing imperial policies of other countries at that time. It is not to say that Italy has that other European powers or other powers are not guilty of the same and much more extensive in terms of temporality colonialism. It is a specific reflection on the nature and the accelerated process of colonialism under fascism, which depends on the violent nature of fascism to begin with. So I think there's a specificity to that comment. I think this is about contemporary Italy, and it's about an episode of contemporary Italy. It is one moment. It does not in any sense suggest that the temporality of Italian colonialism it shouldn't be seen within a wider global temporality of colonialism, of which, of course, Britain, France, many other countries are as more implicated in colonial violence. But I think I think it's about the specificity of the nature of Italian colonialism and fascism.
I'm trying English. And for the second question you were posing, in the selection of artistic works, we selected many works of artists dealing with private archives. And I mean, how to escape from this trap of Italian good people or the worst, no? Many works of art dealing with this topic of the familiar history linked to the history of colonialism as a profound wound. So it's a work on the intimacy of the relationships in the context of colonization of many Italian families who went there, even not being fascist one. For example, Leone Contini has a personal and familiar history of socialist family who went there to Libya because his grandfather was an archaeologist, for example. And so they start to thinking how to manage this kind of intimate relationship between the familiar history and the history with the historical background and the judgment we made about that history. And also the artists dealing with the Afro-descendant artists we are working with in this video, they also start from personal and familiar wounds. People who, for example, in As Marina or the movie we show, little excerpt, there are families born out from relationships sexual or affective relationships between Italians men and local women. So I think that the language, artistic language, has the potentiality to break this kind of opposition that doesn't help us to understand what do we mean when we say difficult heritage. Difficult heritage means that there is a wound and there is a sort of trauma in Italian families and in the families from European or Libyan descendants who today experiments this misrecognition.
Yeah. First of all, congratulations for beautiful work. Really also evoke myself when you show us a footage for Italico, which I spent my dad used to take me to those games. So, and it's interesting how I could reinterpret those images, those memories. So thank you. What I'm curious is that what's the aim of the project? And then when it was conceived, it had in mind an audience from a cultural, political, intense people who look at that, what we're aiming to be. Yeah. Is it clear? Yeah. Thank you. Well, I think, yes, it's a very pertinent question. I mean, in terms of, this is largely intended as a pedagogical resource, in the sense that, just quite specifically, if you're thinking about the study of Italy, Italian culture in general, then it might have been possible some years ago to be simply talking about a canon of Italian literature or Italian peninsular history. Clearly, in this day and age, it's not really feasible, possible, ethical to talk about Italy outside of the global transnational context. And in order to do so, you need to talk about migration, you need to talk about secular colonialism, you need to talk about the contemporary world, you need to see Italy in that perspective, of which, and in that global perspective, Italian colonialism has a role, it has a place, and it needs to be studied, and it needs to be part of that wider global and national history. But in order to do so, one needs resources and one needs to be able to expand the level of engagement. That certainly one of those things is to bring the work of artists, video makers to wider audiences, and also to think about the way in which we can produce resources that are not simply academic essays, but have a certain limited audience that should be conceived of as in dialogue with much wider artistic process and can be mediation between them. The specific political purpose is, this is a university project, it's not the role of universities to involve themselves in specific political action, but much more broadly in action that regards society and culture and ways of talking about it and ways of mediating it. It will be interesting to see its reception in different circumstances.
I try in English. So I think it's like, for us, for me, for Giulia, and for Isabella, it's like an educational tool, this work. It's something that we can use, first of all, to demonstrate that the relationship between a researcher inside the academic context and artists, visual artists, or video artists, or whatever, like this one, can collaborate to create a new approach to these questions of the difficult heritage in Italy. In Italy, the approach to the difficult heritage is like a taboo. It is impossible to discuss this visual heritage especially. So researchers started to work in a collective context with researchers, artists, writers, and sound designer, and everything. Can be a new way to discuss this patrimony, this question. I think this is very important because we have a lot of work of art, architecture in Italy. But we have also now a new generation of artists, of Italian, European artists and Afro-descendant artists that live or already in Italy, that started to discuss this patrimony. So it's very, very important to create an occasion to show this one, and also create a possibility to finance, to propose these new plates, these new tools to change the point of view. We think that it's very important understand that we can intervene, really, in the landscape and also in the imaginary, also in the mentality around this question. I think this is very important. For this reason, we accepted with really enthusiasm this project with charts, because we know, we think that it's very important to do something for the new generation about this one. And so this is maybe one, or only one, possibility to speak also with the older generation that maybe are not really linked with the academic question or academic approach of these questions.
So your future work probably will be more, yeah.
I come from Brazil, and we have the largest Italian community in the world. I just would like to know if you have any plans to talk about the relationship with and you mentioned Europeans a lot there, reference in Africa, and omitting South America or even the United States, which was very colonial in the modern time.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it is only by thinking of things in transnational and global perspective that you are able to draw differences and also temporalities, and to see people's movement and their part within the construction of different polities at different levels globally. To talk about Italian in a sense that is bounded by the confines of the nation is a nonsense. To be able to speak about Italy in genuinely transnational context, one does need to explore the history of colonialism in Italy. One needs to think about migration, one needs to think about communities in the United States, in Australia, in South America. And one needs to think about some of the ways in which those temporalities and sense of belonging are created, above all in the sense of hybridity and constant reflection on the nature of the construction of those identities. The second point is that the role of languages, cultures and societies as modern languages, as a disciplinary identity, really does need to move away from a focus on the European and to the global. It can't necessarily reconstruct itself. I'm talking about the UK in such a way that it involves every area of global interest, but it can do more of that. And one of the things that certainly that one can do as an institute like the School of Advanced Study is to encourage that kind of greater depth of geographical perspective. One thing that we did do, for example, was talk about invite people from the Museum of Civilizations to be in dialogue with the Centre of Latin American Research in the British Museum, and to draw some of the work that they are doing in comparative perspective. This is absolutely necessary, especially in the way that we function more and more as a global polity.
Just a small. I think it's very, very important when Wisalu Babi said about the relationship with the others people in Italy, because she's from Morocco, no? She's an Italian Moroccan girl, so she said, I'm not from an ex-colony, Italian ex-colony, but I'm completely inside this question of the Italian colonialism, because it's like a connection between all people that arrive from the ex-colony Europe. I think this is very important. I teach in the final school in Accademia Belle Arti in Florence, and then I have in my class normally no Afro-descendant people, because in Italy the access for the high study in the art is really horrible. We are, I think you are maybe 1 or 2% of people from Africa in our school of art. This is incredible. But we are now a lot of people from Latin America, from Caribbean state, country, and this one. A lot of these young people from Latin America, from Caribbean are very, very interested in the Italian history of colonialism. And they start to work about the Italian colonialism. Because there is the same question of Lubabi. There is a connection, an intimate connection between the condition to be people that are rising from a colonized country. This is the question. And I think this is very interesting for us, for the work that we are doing now.
So just a final point, because in Brazil, the tradition of trade union or the anarchism came from what you're talking about today, Italy. This Italy, perhaps what I'm suggesting is thinking perhaps a new route of investigation of what this colonial past might lead to, because the resistance against the fascism, and you talk about states as well, the role of states, are socialists, for example, many in favor of states, where fascism as well. So just provocation.
Yeah, certainly. No, certainly. I think, yes, absolutely. This is an intervention that looks about the history and ideology and theory of fascism and the way in which that leads to and is integrated within a history of colonialism. It is telling that story. That story isn't about that is the major strand of the story. To say that that is all about Italian culture, or indeed its resistance, it is talking about a tendency, and a tendency that is still with us, rather than giving such a broad and multifaceted history of Italian colonialism.
Just to say that there are several works on informal colonies also in relation to the Italian migrants. But I think that both our projects have focused on a more, let's say, formal presence, especially in North Africa, in the Horn of Africa. And but again, there are lots of work that has been done, especially in the historiographical side, but also on the social sciences about informal diplomacy and informal way through which Italian communities, let's say, settled in South America, Brazil, and especially in Argentina. So I think that there is, let's start. So I think that it's time for us to wrap it up. I would just comment on the fact that watching the film, and especially with Salubabi passage, has sparked something on my mind about the post-memory mimicry, so imitating and reversing the colonial gaze through innovative forms of the contemporary, and what we are doing, like as a single researchers in teams, but also in the dialogue among different figures, academics, curators, and grassroots initiative that has been quoted here, is a matter of truly retracing the genealogies of contemporary memories of colonialism and how they are affecting both directly and indirectly the public discourse about identity, otherness, and for instance in Italy in a couple of weeks we have a referendum on citizenship which is still affected by colonial bias. And my personal point, and not on the referendum of course, but on this first session, it's actually to find the capacities to study and to deal with the gray zones, because colonialism, of course, has been violence, usurpation, but has been also hybridity, hybridization. In As Marina, it's extremely clear, and we need to really archaeologically dissect all these stories and touch the bodies and the life stories of people, also to gain more insights on the ways in which to deliver then colonial histories and anti-colonial pedagogies, let's say so. So I think that we can Okay, concluding here, and we can gather at 20 past 4. We have some coffees and biscuits outside. Thank you for first of all, thank you.
Okay, we'll start because we don't want to be late. So, welcome everyone, benvenute, benvenuti, benvenuto. My name is Barbara Spadaro. I am senior lecturer in Italian history and culture at the University of Liverpool, here in the UK. And today I am delighted to host 3 speakers and curators that, with whom I've been in conversation over the last few years in order to unlearn the imperial histories that inform my academic background and also the way in which I've been socialized as a white European academic working on Italian colonialism and migration. So some of the conversations that we had over the last few years are available on a podcast called Diasporic Perspectives, Unlearning Imperialism with Libyan and Italian Artists. And today I'm delighted to have here in alphabetical order Najlaa El Ageli, who is an artist, architect and curator based in London. Najlaa is the founder of the Moon Arts and has created more than 30 successful solo and collective exhibitions in the UK, Spain, Italy, and Malta and Libya. In London, she has also curated several exhibitions in collaboration with Schubach Festival and many galleries, and it's impossible to mention all of them, so I will just recall Jewel Tales of Libya, retracing a disappearing landscape at the T21 Gallery, as long as pop art from North Africa at the T21 Gallery. Totalitarian props at the Africa Center, where also Malak El Ghuel and Alessandra Ferrini work was exhibited, and the Almado Al-Fahmi Alternative Museum of Sudan, which also was a fantastic exhibition here in London. In Tripoli, she recently curated the Libyan Pantry, which was a very interesting exhibition about consumer cultures in Libya. And she's just back from Malta, where she curated Small Bones of Courage, a collective exhibition where also Malak work was shown. Malak El Ghuel is a Libyan designer and training counselor, using the arts therapeutically to create space that foster a sense of grounding and connection with heritage. Her work has been exhibited in collectives such as Totalitarian Props that I just mentioned, and her Libyan art-inspired workshops invite participants to experience the beauty of Libyan culture through textiles and engage in meaningful conversation over tea. So this format, this workshop, has been organized many times in London, for example at the Belle Cafe in West London, and most recently at the Winter Garden in Liverpool, in collaboration with the Liverpool Arab Arts Festival and the Mina Study Network at the University of Liverpool. Alessandra Ferrini, who is on the screen up here, is an award-winning artist, researcher, and educator based in the UK and active internationally, with a track history of activism and educational projects through the arts. Alessandra has designed groundbreaking engagement projects. For example, in Italy, I participated in Memory Matters in the Parco del Valentino in Turin. That was a project Alessandra delivered for the Fondazione Sandretto in collaboration also with the Recovery Plan. Her work, Gaddafi in Rome, won the 2022 Maxi Bulgari Prize for Contemporary Arts in Italy, and she was exhibited at the 60th Venice Biennale Stranieri Ovunque, Foreign Everywhere, curated by Adriano Pedrosa. Her first monograph, like Swarming Maggots, confronting the archive of coloniality across Italy and Libya, was commissioned by Villa Romana Florence and published by Archive Books, thanks to an Italian Council award. Alessandra's writing also appears on many platforms. She holds a PhD in practice from the University of the Arts London and she's currently teaching at the Dutch Art Institute as part of Archive Ensemble. Therefore, she joins us today online. So thanks, Alessandra, for being there from the Netherlands. And I will just leave the floor to Najlaa. Prego.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk, as I'm a curator, and I've worked with the idea of the Libyan cultural post-colonial memory. And so I'm going to show the work that I did with this, how I curated it, and also with giving examples of some of the artists. So Libyan cultural post-colonial memory is not just about what we remember from the colonial past, but how we remember it, who gets to do the remembering and what risks are being erased. Italian colonialism in Libya left behind a complex legacy, especially in the visual arts. To speak of Libyan cultural memory today is to confront a landscape shaped as much by erasure, suppression, and silence as by resilience, continuity, and creativity. Libya's story is fragmented not only by the rapture of colonialism, but also by authoritarian rule, censorship, war, displacement, and a fragile national archive. To speak of memory, then, is to reckon with what survives, what has been lost, and how artists, historians, and communities are working to construct what remains. And so one of the biggest projects that I worked on, talking about this, was retracing the disappearing landscape, which, as Barbara mentioned, was shown at the P21 here in London, and also it traveled to Spain, in Madrid, Casa Arabe, and Cordoba. So, next one. So this is one of the artworks that was created by Marcella Manelli, who is an Italian ceramicist based here in London. And before I sort of talk about Marcella's work, I'm going to talk about Disappearing Landscape, how we explored memory through fragments, and the idea of retracing was a key. And it wasn't only about recovering a complete history, but what I attempted to do with the artist is piecing together the past from traces, shadows, and absences. And in this exhibition specifically, the concept of the trace became both evidence of the loss and a tool for reconstruction. Libyan memory is not a whole, it is open-ended and is always there under sort of investigation and negation. So as I mentioned, this is Marcella Mameli Badi's Polaroids installation, and it consisted of 15 ceramic-style Polaroids, and they were made of ceramics, suspended from the ceiling, where each one layered with a haunting image that evoked a violent or traumatic moment from Libya's history. Through these ghostly snapshots, Mameli confronts buried roots and resurfaces collective memories of Libya's turbulent and unstable past. The work not only challenges the erasures of history, but it also questions how certain historical atrocities continue to be weaponized in the present to justify destructive political agendas. And another installation was the Ghazala statue. This statue was one of the sort of legacies of Italian colonial heritage that was left in Libya, and this was designed by an Italian sculptor in the 1930s, Vanetti. So this installation, I worked with 3 artists, Marcella again, Ala Abu Dabouz, who's a Libyan, and Tiwa Barnusa, who's also a Libyan artist and curator. And in this statue, it becomes a symbol of disappearance. And because as it was a famous landmark in Tripoli depicting a woman and a gazelle rooted in the Libyan kind of colonial past. And in 2014, the statue vanished without any explanation, no public record, and it just disappeared. So what the artists did, they responded with images. I mean, this is what happened to it. These are just images of
what happened to the statue before it disappeared, when it was shot in 13. And then these are photographs of the Libyan public and their relationship with the statue. So on what's written in Arabic, after it disappears, it says, "Where is the beauty of Tripoli?" And written by a Libyan. And then there's an image of actually my family, my mom and her dad, standing in front of it, where Libyans used to go and take pictures in front of this colonial, I call it, very problematic colonial statue, but for them it was what their city is about and its beauty. And then the rubble, where what's left behind. And so this is one of the artworks by Ala Boudabous, where he sort of layers words to reflect on memory, loss, and erasure. And the statue's removal became more than a physical disappearance. It was symbolic. So the questions that we seek to ask, was it an act of rejecting colonial legacy, or was it a cultural purge that endangered plural memory? So this leads to a deeper question, really, about Libya and its post-colonial kind of memory. And is that if we mourn the statue, are we mourning a colonial monument or a shared reference point that has evolved and taken on new meanings over time? So, as I say, it's quite a central tension of the Libyan post-colonial memory. Sort of a sad kind of event of what is lost, and it's also complicated by the danger of nostalgia for a past that was itself oppressive. So memory is an ongoing process, and Libyan post-colonial memory isn't static, really. It doesn't just live in museums or state archives. It exists in daily life, in stories, in what's missing, in art that dares to remember differently. So contemporary artists, Libyan and Italian, are exploring these kind of legacies and are using their work to confront the colonial past, critique historical amnesia, and reimagine a national identity. So I'm going to start with Ala Abdounabi, who is a Libyan British artist based in Abu Dhabi. And this is her recent work, which is called "Are Your Memories of Me Enough for You?" And her practice reclaims and recontextualizes colonial imagery. This is her solo show. She focused on the Barbary lion, once a symbol of colonial power, now extinct. Historically kept in royal sort of places, the lion represented imperial dominance. Abdounabi reconfigures it as a symbol of trauma and loss. Her installations, crafted from faux stone, synthetic fur, wax, and salt in this instance, mimic museum displays but subvert them. The instability of her sculptures emphasizes the fragility of colonial narratives themselves. Her work reminds us that collective memory is never whole, and it is curated and it is contested. And then I looked at another artist, architect, curator, Sari Fitouri, who's a Libyan, and then he looks at architecture and he re-examines it, and he explores the colonial sort of era buildings in Benghazi specifically, because he's from Benghazi, and what happened to these kind of urban spaces and buildings after the Civil War. And he sort of and these buildings, how they were designed to assert Italian dominance. And many of these structures have since been absorbed into the Libyan identity, similar to what happened with the statue of the Ghazala in Tripoli, and also sort of modern day Tripoli urban landscape. Fitouri then examines how Libyans have internalized and redefined them over time. Yet he also urges a critical lens, advocating for the preservation of these sites not as an examined heritage, but as complex spaces imbued with both beauty and violence. And one of the installations, the post-war Benghazi, through clashing histories, is the counter-archaeology sort of work that he's recently been producing. And so he blends into abstract, extruded artifacts. And there's to ask the question is that to reconstruct through the archive and to interpret, and the interpretation of it is not a final solution. So rebuilding one memory risks the erasure of another. And his work highlights the distortion and hybridization of Italian and Ottoman legacies as well, generating a third space, an archaeology of resistance not rooted in nostalgia or functionality, but in provocation and contemplation. And then we have also another artist I worked with, he's Libyan based in Libya, he's a calligraphist, but this installation was called Plates of Greed. And it is a moving mediation on cultural erasure. And so he produced 7 white ceramic plates inscribed in Arabic calligraphy, each bearing the name of a place in Libya that no longer exists. Mosques, shrines, theaters, destroyed by war, ideology, or greed. The use of ceramic plates here evokes colonial souvenirs that once portrayed Libya as an exotic prize. But in the case of Al-Kharoubi, how he uses it, he subverts this kind of trope. His plates speak not of conquest, but of mourning. Displayed on traditional veil, as you can see in one of the images, the work is both personal and national. It asks, what are we destroying in our pursuit of profit or power? And can memory really survive when the physical has vanished? And last, there are lots of artists I can go on to, but Alessandra Ferrini, who's also here, and I worked with her in totalitarian props, and her installation, Sight and Scene, and this is where we challenge historical amnesia. And Alessandra confronts the censorship of Italy's colonial crimes, and where her installation focuses on the restricted image of Omar al-Mukhtar's execution, a symbol of Libyan resistance. In Italy, these images are legally limited. So Alessandra doesn't show them directly, she instead underscores their absence. This absence itself becomes part of the violence. Colonial memory isn't just about what happened, really, but about what is allowed to be remembered. So Ferrini's work dismantles the myth of benign colonialism. Through blurred visuals and restrained storytelling, she invites the viewer to sit with the discomfort of what is omitted, censored, or erased. And lastly, in conclusion, I have to say Libyan cultural memory is not a finished archive. It is a living, breathing process. It endures in fragments, in reimagined symbols, and in the work of artists who compel us to think more deeply about what we've forgotten and why. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Malak. I'm an artist, designer, Libyan artist, designer, and a trainee counselor at the moment. I wanted to talk a bit about, I'll just walk you through roughly about some of my art journey, some of my artworks, and then kind of where I am at the moment in terms of looking at kind of culture, the textiles, and also my interest in kind of spaces where we can gather and like make together and maybe kind of learn from each other and have this space where something kind of can go further, where I believe art kind of is an amazing tool for that. It requires some curiosity to push the boundaries beyond the kind of static vision of the past or the pure good or pure evil, and how does the past touch all of us, I guess. And that's how I met Barbara. But a bit about my journey with art. So I guess I leaned into art mostly post-2011, after the Arab Spring, after the fall of Gaddafi. That was such a kind of strong, that was such a big year of my life and every Libyan's life. So I feel like after that there was a lot of kind of curiosity about what is our identity beyond this figure that kind of overpowered so much of our life. So that's kind of where I started to look at kind of the me, the collective, us, and where does that kind of take us. These are some of my projects, some of my research, some of the things that I kind of touched on in terms of identity, movement, displacement, and like where do we fit into the world, where do I fit into the world,
This one, sorry.
So in going into that journey, there's quite a lot to uncover. There are different layers of what it means to be Libyan. There's the kind of our Mediterranean aspect, the kind of Arab identity, the Pan-African identity, our strange relationship with Italy, the strange kind of romanticized idea of Italy that I feel also was magnified by the anti-Gaddafi sentiment, especially in Tripoli, where I think part of the rejection of Gaddafi's Libya was to go back further and somehow hold on to that kind of link to Italy, and how did it touch on our culture and our day-to-day life. Nostalgia gets such a bad rap, but I kind of feel like there is a part where in the middle of chaos, to kind of look back, it does uncover a lot. And so looking back at kind of archives, objects, family stories, what we tell ourselves, and kind of what is the reality of the situation, and the strangeness and the contradiction of the colonial past, but also the admiration, kind of disillusionment with the past and the present and all of that. So that's kind of my journey. So I kind of tried to figure out what was Libya, going so far as where did pre-modern border Libya, our kind of medieval tribes going back decades ago, the Amazigh culture, the pharaohs, the kind of our connection to the Greek Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman colonization as well, some of the iconography, and what it means to kind of touch on that. And then a bit about kind of our Arab identity, the Arab dream. That was a project that I worked on for the authoritarian props, and I was kind of looking at this Arab dream, and it's the song that everyone knows, Al-Hilm Al-Arabi, the Arab dream, which is really centered around the question of Palestine, and how does that kind of move across and shape also our understanding of ourselves now, and our extension to what it means to be African or North African, and our connection to the rest of the continent. So those are bits and pieces. Most of them are video collages. And they're just kind of a byproduct of some research, but also kind of my reflection on these things. And I guess in that 15 years, by 2020, I reached a point where it was the kind of tension of looking at not having enough archives and kind of trying to understand why have we lost all our kind of archives, whether it was intentional or unintentional, and also what is the story that was kind of preserved. And while that was happening, I guess the 2020 war that was going on in Libya, I kind of started a series of recording conversations with people who were just internally displaced at the time, just to kind of preserve some of these stories. And that led to this kind of long project of trying to document parts of that, but also trying to figure out how to showcase it. And at the time, I was working on a residency in the UAE, and part of kind of showcasing that artwork was also paying attention to the intricacy of that. And so it was, again, kind of trying to preserve and show something in a place where you also had to kind of not sure of the right word here, but figure out how to really show something, because as the Arab dream, we are kind of in conflict with one another at the moment. So that was the project that really kind of got me to look into preservations, but also what's next, and kind of how can I use art as a method to kind of build on something rather than just interact with it or try to understand. And from that point, this is where I started to look at other ways of using art as a different medium. And one of those ways was kind of like looking at textiles and trying to figure out how to kind of bring people together through that and really look at it. And I think the thing that I kept realizing was that Libya was a giant question mark in the minds of so many people. I guess in the collective unconscious, there's a lot of gaps. And so part of it is really telling our story beyond the gaze of the other. And then part of it is seeing how that translates with other people. And so this is kind of where I started doing these kind of workshops inspired by those Libyan clothing and our heritage. And part of it was showing some of who we are, some of the pictures that were kind of family photos. And then part of it was sharing that knowledge, the diversity that we have, the kind of, I guess, the heritage that I'm also feeling that's being lost and is kind of deteriorating. So that's, in some way, that's also another form of preservation. And using kind of, I mean, art is life, and that is part of our life, the clothing, the food, how we do things, and I guess music and everything. So that's pretty much it. These were the kind of workshops where we use maybe as an inspiration, but from that I got to meet so many different people, including Barbara, and talking about kind of the past and how it links us. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And I guess I did want it to say that, you know, the curiosity is part of the rebellion and play is resistance, and those are the parts where things can really pushed to figure out and reimagine something for the future rather than that kind of feeling of stuckness. And I did want to go back a bit here where I thought I did kind of in the journey of that, kind of looking at our relationship with the word decolonize and what it does mean to decolonize in the global south versus in the global north. So part of it is kind of justice, repair, and the other part is how to kind of thought there to decolonize education, therapy, art, and to kind of all constantly ask ourselves, whose voice is this? Whose comfort am I protecting? And you know, it starts with the individual, and then it's a collective effort, really. Yeah, I think these were some of the workshops, and yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really, really sorry for not being there. If you saw me smiling at the beginning when Barbara was introducing us, because I was receiving texts from people in the audience because they were expecting me to be there, but I'm not, and it's a shame because for once everybody comes to London, I couldn't be there, but I really have to be teaching here, so here I am. So thanks for Charles and Gianmarco for organizing this and for having me online, Barbara as well for organizing this panel. And so I prepared just a little overview as well of 3 projects. Since the focus of today is collaboration, just looking at different ways that I collaborate with different people and thought about collaboration in different ways. In my work, one project, the first project I will talk about is one that Barbara mentioned before. It was called Curatorial. It was developed as part of Memory Matters, a project by Fondazione Director Baudengo in Turin in collaboration with Belle della Democrazia. And at the time, I was asked to make a public artwork, which wasn't really, not really using this kind of language, so it was quite challenging, and what I really wanted to do was to work on Pastor Valentino in Turin because of its role in hosting the expos, international expos, national expos, and so I devised in the end audio guide, audio book actually. There are 4. So here you can see in the images just like a QR code, there were QR codes throughout the park. And there was this map, here you can have a better look, with different places where the audio, you could play with all different kind of tracks. Also, there were other artworks displayed as part of Memory Masters. The Parco de Valentino, after I started this project, became the sort of incubator for the whole project. So there were other works we see along the way from our work by Gianmarco, one by Leone Contini, one by Ageli and Silvia Rodi. And so for me, what was interesting was thinking about sound, and the audiobook has sort of intimate relation with the listener, because you are, first of all, you can address and reach a very different public than the one generally reaching galleries and museums. So that was something I was really interested, also in thinking about, what kind of language I was going to develop to sort of create a better, let's say, I don't want to say accessibility, probably is not the right word, but just language that, could speak to a wider audience, let's say. And also the fact that what was interesting is the idea that you're speaking directly to the person who's, listening, putting their headphones, and they're putting headphones, and you're talking directly to their ears, and that I thought was an interesting quality to explore and think about how we could talk directly to them in a way. And from the beginning, I knew that I was gonna do this work I could only do this work with Max Stefanelli, who is an audio producer. I worked with him before, in 2016, when I worked on a project called Radio Ghetto Relay, which was a project around radio in il Ghetto di Lignano, in close to Foggia. So it's a radio that he participated in setting up, that was set up in this shanty town where the tomato pickers that exploited in southern Italy lived. And so we already worked on that together, and I asked him, because he's got plenty of experience working in this kind of format, to work with me also, because I was inspired by this practice, and it was very important for me not to just use kind of appropriate his way of working and make sure he was doing it with me. And then the other person I work with is Master Viviana, who's a long-term colleague, friend, person I share a lot with, but also without her participation, part of the issue that I wanted to also tackle with this wouldn't have been possible, because one of these audiobooks is focused on Giulia, which is where the very first human zoo was set up in Italy in the Expo of 1884. And so there were other questions to do with not recirculating certain traumatic history. I mean, obviously this history is very, very painful and very, very delicate as well. But we wanted to tackle this through all the sound and narration, and not by recirculating images, for instance. And Magda worked specifically on this track for the Giulia, and I focused more on the other parts, and we were looking at sort of different expos, specifically 1911 and then 1884, but I was also interested in this other moment, which is 1911 and sort of 50th anniversary of the Italian unification. And so we worked together making this, and then we did another, I will skip this because 15 minutes is very short, but we engaged in a very short extract from the track about the human zoo that Martha worked on. From my work that in case you're interested, it's a very short track, and all the tracks anyway are aligned with Paris in town only. Then this project, I was asked by the Fondazione to make another version. I mean, I was asked to work with schools, and often in my work I use education, go to schools, specifically high schools, and sort of translating the projects I realize into projects to realize with students. And in this case, we did another version, so now there's 2 maps in fact, the Valentino that you can exploit and explore it together as well. I know the Fondazione keeps using them with the education department, and it's sort of, we made sort of a hybrid combination of 2, not all of the tracks together because it's sort of like an hour and a half to almost 2 hours long. But with this class I worked with a class from Liceo Classico, Burdett in the center of Turin. Just a note is that for a long time I made projects in schools in Italy, talking about colonial history, and it was very difficult for me to access schools for a very long time. I use art to approach schools, because if I was asked to go in with history, it was much more difficult. And now I can finally access also sort of Liceo Classico and Scientifici, which before I could not, because only the art school. And we use art to sort of bring in that into these topics into the school system. And now the conversation is very different, and we can finally work with a range of schools actually. And with this class, we work on making on these 4 new tracks, looking specifically at these 4 statues dedicated to 4 men, and this idea of hero, what does a hero mean today, thinking about notions of fatherland, and basically just rethinking, do we still need heroes, are these still heroes for us? And so we looked around at 40 very different people, Massimo D'Azeglio, Carlo Montù, Umberto Cagni, Guglielmo Marconi, and anche la Rai Cesare Battisti. So these are also, this is also online, it's available again only in Italian, but again we work with Marco Gaffè and Marco Stefanelli in the school as well. So that's one project I wanted to briefly introduce. Then these are going to be much briefer talking about this, because tomorrow I'm pretty sure what they do, Najlaa will probably talk a bit about after also, but this is a project, Unruly Connections, which I developed for Arti course in Bolzano in 2022, the other project is 2021. And for this project, there was different coincidence of factors that basically, often in the art world, it's very difficult to develop long-term research, and all the funding are sort of devoted for production, and fees for artists, research, it's very difficult to come by actually. There's also this idea that they will produce your work and then you will sell it and it will be okay, but not all artists, especially artists with this kind of work, that do are on the market for different reasons. Some are political, some ethical, some are just that you not really work much. And but in this case, so there were some issues with this exhibition, and I was working on inspired by Roberta Berger, who was the historian Roberta Berger. I was looking at the relations between the settlements in the settled colonialism in Libya and the colonization and annexation of South Tyrol, and a different kind of monuments that refer to colonial history in Bolzano. But I was very interested in looking more deeply, building on a previous work that Najlaa actually mentioned before, which is 2016. I was interested in looking at the Libyan genocide, but I was very conscious that I didn't want again to circulate sort of a history of pain, focusing on telling a history of pain. And so I decided to look at different people who tried to oppose the ban on the documentation of the genocide in different, mostly through literature. And I looked at Reda Canelli, for instance, in the to the novel Loyalty. She's different ways to sort of bypass censorship during fascism, to publish the story that somehow we tell happened in media, but under camouflage. And then another book is An Encounter by the old boy, and there's also another reason why I was interested in this, because I was contacted by someone who asked me to look into him, so it's visible in the exhibition. And then the last book that I was really interested in working on was The Constant Blaster by Gaffè. I was interested in the fact that, of course, it's not history about Libya, but about a history about an actor that is taken to Libya at the time of the repression of the anti-colonial resistance, that is the sort of height of that. And so we managed to basically redistribute the funding for production that I was really interested in using to produce that kind of Polish art work. And we were lucky enough to be able to, after a long negotiation with gallery, because it was not that straightforward, but I was very, very lucky to be able to use the money to commission the translation of the book after the Italian from the original in Virginia. That was the law realized that there was, again, like just other ways of thinking. It's just about collaboration, but it's about hijacking current formats and infrastructures of the art world because of all the constraints that there are out there. And then I will finish just by very briefly introducing this book, which I apologize to all the people who should would have received it already. I myself haven't received it yet. But it's the book I worked on last year, and it contains documentation of 7 years of project around Libya, 3 main projects: the Gravano project, the work that I just talked about, the early connections, and sort of all the different work I did around the genocide in Libya, and then a new body of work, which is more personal, but it's also somehow linked to this history. And in this book, the funding I could get with the Italian Art Council, which is funded for art, which is generally a very focused for publication of monographs by artists about artists. But I wasn't really interested in just, having say more kind of formats of, pictures and commission, estate and creative practice. And we managed again to some sort of like justice to use the space and this funding to do other things, to, for instance, fund Theo Barnosa's residency in Italy, starting research and look at the relation between a relation with colonial history in Libya. And also we used the budget to translate material that hadn't been previously translated from Arabic, specifically some documents that were produced by the resistance in the 30s, and that work was a work that Adam Bin Kafir did, work of translation. And then I could again fund and support some younger Libyan practitioners like Celia Faturia that Najlaa has mentioned before, Malak El Ghuel, Libyan American, and her work in collaboration with Nicola Cantafeletto on Alessandra Ferrini. Then we reprinted some work of Khaled Matawa, very early work, with the idea that then we will also translate it to Italian, because the idea is that this publication will also be in Italian and open access. And so, yeah, so Barbara as well participated with some conversation with Alessandra Ferrini around publishing in Libya and the idea of publishing with resistance and sort of an archive. So the book is sort of kind of trying to be a conversation in a way between my work and other reflections and people that I've been really inspired by and sort of thinking along with or in conversation with for some time, and also partly use it as a platform for showcase their brilliant work and gather certain voices that work around Italian colonial relations. I'm going to stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Alessandra. panel about collaborations, collaborative practices, and I think we have kind of put on the plate a lot of examples of collaborations, whether through between artists and academics, or participants of various backgrounds into a space held by an artist and therapist, or curatorial practices and engagement programs, or public art, or publishing and translation, which is another radical practice of collaboration that Alessandra in particular has been using in her work. So thank you for this, and I think I will leave space to questions from the audience.
Just get things going. Thank you for those fantastic presentations. Just a question in particular to Alessandra. I mean, what's very striking can you hear? No. Yeah.
Sorry, I cannot really hear.
Okay.
Because I was told that we have to speak in the microphone.
The principal one.
Okay, right, yes.
Not that one.
Can you hear us from here,
I
Alan?
can't hear very well, so even when Barbara speaks, it's not close to the laptop, I can't hear very well.
Can you try that?
Even from
Can
here?
you hear now, Alessandra?
From here, I hear very well. Because
From
there,
here?
I hear. Yeah.
Just,
Otherwise, there is a microphone, I believe. Sorry about this.
Sorry, Alessandra, one of the things that emerges very strongly from your work is the way that you use literature and the written word. In a sense, you work fundamentally at the crossroads between literature and artistic representation. I mean, in a sense, the counter question is, does it make sense to talk about literature without artistic representation? Certainly we can do, but perhaps we shouldn't be. We should be thinking in a much more rounded way about the interaction between art and literature.
Sure. I mean, if you mean like like working on literature but not working on versus artists that have done similar things. To me, what was interesting about literature in this case is, in terms of talking about literature when that the project around specifically novel and fiction, is the fact that while I was trying to think about the genocide, I was very interested in not recirculating certain kind of images, even though I mean they're very little in terms of images on the genocide, but I was very conscious about how I didn't want to reproduce those images and put them out there, and I was very conscious of not doing that. And so literature to me offered also that space that you can enter it, or if you really want to read it, it's not in your face like an image is, and those material that then I kind of use in the exhibition space. Sorry, I didn't show pictures of the actual installation, but so again, they can give you an idea. You can form a sort of mental image, but the images weren't actually replicated and again displayed and monumentalized. So I'm interested in that relation between the sort of written word in certain instances, or the telling of the story like Martha we did with Martha and the audio book, because with certain issues I'm really conscious of not reproducing them, but the images can really sometimes are very difficult to control when you are showing them. But probably didn't answer your question.
I'd like to, well, more than a question, it's a comment or I think food for discussion, especially for Najlaa and Malak, because like you mentioned, of course, post-colonial identity and let's say post-colonial memory. But for instance, Gaddafi has a very different politics of memory toward the Italian past if we compare to King Idris period. So if you want, just delve into this kind of dialectics of memory also, because in your presentation I've noticed some pictures that were from from the 50s, not exactly from the, let's say, Italian colonial period. So, and Gaddafi built up a lot on saying that, okay, this was kind of continuation of the Italian presence. I just want it's for the floor. Also, Ali, if you want to step in. Thank you.
Yes, the images that I used, especially from like the family albums, were from the 50s and 60s. I don't know what we're going to do. I think I'll go there. Because Alessandra, you can't hear us, can you?
No. No.
This one is not working. Alessandra, you here? Yeah. Yes, the images, most of the images that we used were from the 1950s and the 1960s as, I think, with modernity to Libya, which came after, with independence and the kingdom. My mother's generation and the generation that was born in the 1940s and the 1930s had access to cameras. And also the Renaissance in the Arab world at that time, modernity, especially where women were educated, and so education became available to a lot of people. And taking photographs became a natural way of archiving life and society. During the Gaddafi era, taking photographs was more or less banned. If you had a camera in the street, you would be caught. And so there was like this kind of an archive, the memory of that time was literally somehow, it stopped in time. So the only access of images that we can have of Libya, specifically in the 80s and the 90s, was either through personal family albums, and a lot of people did not want to share. They became scared of sharing their own kind of experiences. So a lot of it was kept private, but also public life was not really shared in terms of imagery between even Libyans, unless it was presented through sort of, the national television or the newspapers. So this kind of post-colonial memory, as I said, was all fragmented, and there's a lot of sort of images that you can see or things that you can touch and sort of physical things from the era of King Idris. But during the Gaddafi era, things have started to disappear or to be erased. And actually people themselves developed this kind of habit of forgetting or not recognizing. So it's quite it's a very interesting kind of, I say, problem that we have in terms of what we have and how we use it and how we look at it. And this also, Malak mentioned this idea of nostalgia that is very, I think is very problematic because it doesn't really help with how people, Libyans specifically, deal with post-colonial memory. I think Gaddafi, also, when we did totalitarian props in 2023, we looked at the imagery that was used by the sort of propaganda that lived in the Libyan memory, and most of it was words, rhetoric. Also, the Green Book that was produced by Gaddafi became a way of life, more or less, where children had to study it, and its slogans were everywhere. And so that became part of the sort of the collective memory that stayed in the Libyan psyche during the Gaddafi era. And history was another interesting kind of problem that we had in Libya. And then it's like everybody that comes, even now, everybody comes, writes history to their own kind of agenda. Or so words definitely And the exhibition that I curated and I worked with, Alessandra was part of it, and Malak as well, how words and the imagery, how Gaddafi decolonized somehow the Italian or the Western sort of, visual landscape that Libyans had. He succeeded, I think, in imposing a lot of sort of the ethnic kind of designs into his, the way he dressed, also the tents that he had. They had all of these kind of designs that were based on the local kind of Libyan design of textiles, or fabrics. And that became embedded again in the Libyan psyche. So if you ask any Libyan now who was born or who lived through that, especially the people who were born in the 1980s and 90s, and what they remember from the Gaddafi era is mainly the clothes, the imagery of the green color, how it became the main kind of color that was associated with Libya and the Libyan psyche. The different shades of green. Actually, we did a whole installation about the different shades of green and how that contributed to how you are close. I mean, and what are your loyalties are, depending on the green that you sort of followed or the green that you sort of liked. And so color, words, and also the propaganda that Gaddafi with music, that became very sort of part of the cultural kind of vibe at the time, where music played a major part, of course using rhetoric, propaganda in the music that was produced, and speeches. It was constant. It was all the time. So that, I mean, I didn't show a lot of that exhibition, and so that replaced somehow. I think that was a way of decolonizing the kind of visual imagery of Italy and the West.
Yeah, I would kind of, it's getting very awkward. I would kind of like add to that I feel like Gaddafi built on the narrative that comes from this like lineage of opposing the West and kind of like opposing this bigger monster, and that was kind of his, that's his hero moment, and that was his plot. And so in a strange way, I think for the generations that followed, I guess that's where becoming anti-Gaddafi was more leaning towards the kind of romanticism of the Italian era. So that's kind of played this weird dance in between, and I guess for the kingdom that was almost like, oh, well, he worked with the British and the Americans and kind of opened an American base and allowed them to kind of fly their planes. And even when it came to the question of Palestine, because there were rumors that was kind of used as a kind of almost like a stop towards that part of the world. And so this is the kind of anti-kingdom, anti-West, and that's where the king was kind of more associated with, like, you're helping the West, where they're more intricate and complicated, but yeah.
I mean, all I can say is that that's something I kind of explored in specifically the last film I made on the Gaddafi in Rome series. So also they collected a lot of stamps and from the Gaddafi era where there was sort of this exploitation of colonial. I mean, this rhetoric of this anti-colonial, like Gaddafi as the head of the anti-colonial struggle, and the way, particularly, I was just opposing it in a way that both Berlusconi and Gaddafi sort of exploited that colonial trauma in different ways through the freedom, friendship, partnership, and cooperation.
Yes, but can you come here? Because I speak in the microphone. Because that's the only way she can hear us.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the presenters for the fascinating panel. And I felt at home because when you show the picture, family picture in front of the statue, and the first picture I have myself, I experienced all this, myself and my mom in front of an Italian building, which was again an example of modernity. And so the point I want to make is in both presentations, there was a lot of emphasis on this aspect of somehow claiming the colonial heritage as part of our heritage, which is a very important point, because I think it's a way of shifting the focus of the afterlife of colonialism from the colonizer side to the former colonizer to the former colonizer. And my question is, as I found a lot of similarities, again, as I said, with the country from which I came in Trail, my feeling is that normally this nostalgia is both a sort of sharing this colonial inherited idea of modernity. Again, there is also a sort of, looking at the Italian case, the Italian experience is compared with what happened after, which is considered much worse.
Yeah.
So romanticism comes from this. My question is there class as an issue to address? Because my feeling is that these perceptions are normally from urban context, from more or less middle bourgeoisie. Yes. What about the areas, the rural areas, or those who in the urban areas were not exactly from portion society? Is class an issue to be addressed when discussing this afterlife of colonialism?
I would say that also kind of links back to the narrative of Gaddafi, because I think, yes, class does matter, and I think rural area versus kind of Tripoli or Benghazi, which is like the big cities, or it does matter, even in the kind of collective, because they kind of managed to preserve traditions much better, their way of life, and also embody it. It wasn't kind of something on display, it was part of the life, and that continues, and that's where, because we had situation after situation, it's very hard to say, oh, you can't kind of trace back something to specifically post. It becomes more complicated, and then I think with Gaddafi, then the narrative and the performance, and some of actually what he managed to do is help those rural areas. I think during his era, there were a lot of horrible things, but there was also a lot of progression, especially outside of those capitals. And so there is a difference even in how people kind of perceive those different areas. So yeah, class does matter, and I don't know if that answers it, but yeah.
Well, it's also similar, I mean, class definitely, yes. But the same thing, what's happened, I think, in Libya is also similar to what happened in terms of modernity and the post-colonial kind of memory. Same thing happened in Iraq, same thing happened in Algeria. I mean, Algeria is a bit, it's much more sort of traumatic. Tunisia, even Egypt. But each one is sort of the relationship that they had with their colonial kind of the power that ruled them. However, I think what happened is also we have to take into consideration other factors that played into that, like independence. With Libya it's Gaddafi. At the same time, we've got the dictatorships. The era of the dictatorships, and also Pan-Arabism. Pan-Arabism played a major part in the sort of the structure of how society is. That the rhetoric played a huge part into the collective memory of Libyans as Arabs, and also of Libyans, again, with the rhetoric of Pan-Africanism. So this, as Malak mentioned, that these kind of raptures that kept taking place almost every sort of 10, 15 years during his rule have caused confusion of who we are. And no, it's true. I mean, I'm one of those. And I think once we, also the problem with Libyans is never confront the trauma in their history and in their memory, and sort of through art and through, we're trying to sort of open up a conversation of what happened. Also the lack of knowledge, I think, and the lack of acknowledging sort of the failures of Libyans as we are, you know, as a collective. So class did play a part into it, but I think other factors also came into it, like Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism, and what's happening now, which is a complete disintegration of everything.
I'd also say even kind of the idea of modernity, I guess. Like
modernity versus...
No, but also what does it mean? Like, whose version of modernity it is? Because, you know, you can argue that, you know, pre that there was a society that coexisted, that had a way of life and a way of being. It wasn't kind of, like, it's not like there was a land of savages and then all of a sudden, oh wow, like, these massive buildings and, like, this is also the kind of narrative of the Western perspective. But I think we also, like, digested it and became internalized, and now we have this view of ourselves that, you know, not just that we're confused, but also unable to detangle of whose vision and whose, you know, whose voice is it? And also lack of understanding of who we are, and I guess the constant ruptures don't help, and so, you know, it's good. It takes time.
No, just in case Alessandra wanted to ask something, but I don't think she
Yeah, Alessandra.
I don't think this question was for me.
Anyone else wants to come to the mic and ask
very nice
questions?
being the point.
Yeah. So no, I'm told that we should get to.
No, of course.
Okay. No, I mean, if you want to ask anything, just say that. No.
I have a lot of work to do.
I know. No, and I just want to know, if I can close this, maybe I'll
the
mic. So Alessandra can also hear us, Charlie. Yeah, I just want to thank you for coming here into this space. Thanks to Charles and to Gianmarco for holding the space today. This is an academic institutional space. And I think that I'm just learning so much, just by stepping back and letting your perspective opening mine and just revealing how much I am dissatisfied with some epistemological framework and how much I don't want to replicate that type of epistemic violence and how much, these type of questions are, we just need to face them. And so also to think like, yes, the shared past between Italy and Libya, in which kind of framework do we keep looking at it? Are we actually opening it up, listening to voices and perspectives from the global south? Or are we just, keep asking the same questions, the same definition? I think, I hope that Malak and Najlaa and Alessandra, that is very much engaged into this type of work, have kind of opened some questions, and that we can continue the conversation also later. And thank you very much for coming today. Thanks for all.
Thank you.